Hi guys and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we step onto a frozen medieval road beneath a pale winter sky, where every breath hangs like smoke in the air and every distant tree seems to hide something unpleasant. You pull your wool cloak tighter while snow crunches beneath worn leather boots, and somewhere ahead a horse snorts nervously in the darkness. Medieval winter travel was slow, cold, uncomfortable, and occasionally fatal in ways that make modern delayed flights feel almost adorable. You probably will not survive this journey if you forget something as simple as dry firewood or an extra pair of socks. Honestly, damp feet alone are preparing to ruin your entire personality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, maybe leave a comment sharing your location and local time. It is always strangely comforting imagining listeners scattered across the world, wrapped in blankets while thinking about frozen roads from 700 years ago. Now, dim the lights and imagine yourself standing beside a muddy road somewhere in northern Europe during the late Middle Ages. Snow drifts slowly through the air. The afternoon light is already fading, even though it feels far too early for evening. Winter days are short here. Painfully short, the kind of short where the sun seems lazy and unreliable, as though it briefly checks on humanity before disappearing again behind grey clouds. You are not travelling for pleasure. Almost nobody is. A common historical reality of medieval life is that most long journeys happened from necessity rather than curiosity. Merchants carried cloth, salt, wine, and iron tools between towns. Pilgrims travelled toward shrines seeking healing or forgiveness. Messengers crossed kingdoms with sealed letters, hidden inside leather satchels. Peasants sometimes fled famine or war, and occasionally some unfortunate noble decided this season looked perfectly suitable for moving an entire household across half the continent. That noble was wrong, by the way. Winter roads are dreadful. You can smell them before you fully see them. Wet earth, horse manure, wood smoke drifting from distant cottages, rotting straw pressed into frozen mud by cartwheels. Medieval roads are rarely paved outside major cities. Most are little more than dirt tracks cut through forests and fields. Once winter arrives, they become unpredictable ribbons of ice, slush, and hidden holes waiting patiently to twist your ankle. Your small travel group moves carefully along the road. Two merchants walk beside a cart piled with wool bundles covered in waxed cloth. A thin priest mutters prayers quietly into his sleeves. One teenage servant keeps rubbing his hands together and blowing warm air into stiff fingers. Nobody speaks very much anymore. Cold weather steals conversation the same way it steals feeling from your nose. The horses seem tired already. That is another thing medieval travellers fear constantly during winter journeys. Exhaustion, not dramatic nightly exhaustion from heroic battles, just slow physical depletion. The dull ache of walking for hours in wet clothes while carrying too much weight. Your shoulders burn, your toes sting, your stomach growls constantly because winter food is plain and limited. A curious little detail from surviving travel accounts reveals that some travellers carried onions in their pockets to eat raw during long trips. Imagine crunching into a freezing onion while snow blows into your face and a suspicious man named Ulrich insists the nearby forest is haunted. History really knows how to create unforgettable moments. Ahead, the road curves between dark pine trees, and immediately everyone becomes quieter. Forests frighten medieval travellers even during summer. During winter they become something worse. Thick branches block sunlight, snow muffles sound. The world feels strangely empty except for the creaking of wagons and the distant caw of ravens overhead. You glance toward the trees. Nothing moves. That somehow feels less comforting. At night these forests become almost completely black. No electric lights. No glowing windows in the distance, just moonlight, torches, and imagination combining into a deeply unpleasant experience. Medieval people genuinely believed dangerous things lurked in isolated places, Some fears were practical: wolves, bandits, exposure. Others drifted into superstition: wandering spirits, demons, strange creatures glimpsed through snowfall. Scholars continue debating how literally medieval communities believe these supernatural tales versus using them as cautionary stories for travellers and children. Either way, when you are cold, exhausted, and surrounded by endless trees, your imagination becomes extremely cooperative. The priest suddenly stops walking. Everyone freezes. For a moment, all you hear is wind brushing through branches overhead. Then comes the sound again, a faint cracking noise somewhere deeper in the forest. One merchant whispers something under his breath, probably a prayer, possibly a complaint about dying in snow beside expensive wool fabric. The older driver lifts a lantern higher. Its weak orange glow barely reaches beyond the roadside ditch. The darkness beyond seems enormous, alive somehow. Then a deer bursts through the trees. Half the group nearly collapses from relief. The deer disappears quickly into the snow while nervous laughter spreads through the travellers. Even the priest smiles faintly now, though he pretends not to. Fear during medieval winter journeys often comes from uncertainty more than actual danger. You rarely know what waits ahead. Roads disappear beneath snow, rivers freeze unpredictably, inns may already be full, a broken wagon axle can trap you miles from shelter, and shelter matters more than almost anything else. You continue walking as daylight fades further. The temperature drops quickly now. You can feel it in your fingertips first, then your ears, then your cheeks. One of the merchants points ahead. At first you see nothing. Then finally, through drifting snow, a tiny orange glow flickers in the distance. An inn? Not a grand, cheerful tavern like fantasy stories enjoy imagining. This place looks squat, smoky, and overcrowded, but right now it might as well be a palace. Warmth leaks faintly from shuttered windows. You smell stew cooking somewhere inside. Wood smoke curls upward into the darkening sky. You arrive beside several other travellers already crowding near the doorway. A horse shakes melted snow from its mane. Someone coughs violently nearby. A pair of muddy boots hangs beside the entrance, attempting the impossible task of drying. Inside, the air feels heavy with heat and sweat and damp wool. Honestly, it smells terrible. But after hours on frozen roads, terrible smells become strangely reassuring. A historical fact many people forget is that medieval inns varied wildly in quality. Some offered decent food and straw bedding. Others were little more than barns where strangers slept packed tightly together for warmth. Privacy barely exists. Fleas definitely exist. Loud snoring exists with terrifying confidence. You settle onto a rough wooden bench near the fire. The flames crackle softly while travellers thaw stiff hands beside glowing coals. Steam rises from wet cloaks. Someone passes around dark bread hard enough to qualify as construction material. A tired woman rocks a crying child gently near the wall. Outside, snow continues falling silently over the road you barely escaped before nightfall. And already you understand the greatest fear of medieval winter travel. Not war, not monsters, not even wolves. It is simply being caught outside when darkness and cold finally close around you together. Morning arrives reluctantly. The inn grows noisy long before sunrise as travellers prepare themselves for another day on the road. You wake stiff and overheated beneath a rough wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke and old sheep. Somewhere nearby, a man snores with astonishing commitment. Someone else is already coughing into the darkness. The fire has shrunk into dim orange embers, and cold air leaks through gaps in the wooden walls. For one glorious moment you consider staying here forever. Unfortunately, medieval travel does not really support emotional boundaries. So you pull on damp boots and step outside into a world coloured entirely in grey and white. Fresh snow covers the road now. Thin morning light spreads across frozen fields while your breath curls upward like pale ribbons. Horses stamp nervously near the stable. One of the merchants mutters that the snowfall looks deeper than expected. Nobody answers him because everyone already knows he's correct. The forest ahead waits silently beneath heavy snow. And that is where the real unease begins. Wolves terrified medieval travellers in ways modern people sometimes struggle to understand. Today, most people imagine wolves as distant wildlife photographed beautifully, beside inspirational quotes about freedom. Medieval villagers viewed them rather differently, especially during winter. A widely accepted historical fact is that harsh winters pushed wolves closer to human settlements throughout parts of medieval Europe. Food became scarce in forests, especially after long freezes killed smaller animals or buried them beneath snow. Hungry packs sometimes followed roads and villages searching for scraps, livestock, or easier prey, which unfortunately includes exhausted humans travelling slowly through snow. You walk beside the cart while frost crunches underfoot. The priest pulls his hood tighter around his face. One servant carries a spear now instead of leaving it strapped beside the wagon. The horses seem uneasy. Animals often notice things before people do, which sounds poetic until you realise the horse is essentially announcing that something unpleasant may already be nearby. The road narrows between towering pine trees. Snow hangs thick across branches overhead. Occasionally clumps fall with soft thuds beside the trail. The sound makes everyone jump anyway. You hear very little inside the forest. That becomes unsettling quickly. No birdsong, no running water, just the steady creak of wagon wheels and the faint jingle of harness chains. Medieval forest during winter could feel almost unnaturally still. Travellers wrote about silence in surviving journals and monastery records with surprising frequency. Not peaceful silence either. Waiting silence. A younger merchant suddenly points toward the trees. Tracks. You stop beside several deep prints pressed into fresh snow. Large, round, moving parallel to the road. Nobody speaks for a moment. Then the older wagon driver kneels carefully beside them. He brushes away snow with a gloved hand and exhales slowly. "Wolves," he says. "Wonderful." The tracks continue between the trees for several yards before disappearing into thicker brush. You notice how close they remain to the road. That detail bothers everyone. A strange little tidbit appears in some medieval folklore from France and Germany, where travellers carried bells or metal charms partly to scare wolves away during lonely journeys. Whether the bells actually helped is questionable, but frightened humans throughout history have always enjoyed making noise in dangerous places. Modern campers still do the same thing. Apparently shouting awkwardly into wilderness while pretending not to panic is timeless human behaviour. The group continues forward with renewed tension. Now every sound feels sharper. A branch cracks somewhere far behind you. The horses react immediately, tossing their heads and snorting clouds into the cold air. One servant grips his spear harder. Another, he reaches for the small axe hanging from his belt. You turn slowly toward the forest. Nothing. Only trees. Historians still debate how often wolves truly attacked medieval travellers versus how much fear exaggerated isolated incidents into larger cultural terror. Some records certainly describe deadly attacks during brutal winters. Others may have blended real danger with superstition and storytelling. Fear spreads quickly when roads are dark and communication is limited. And honestly, once you spend enough hours freezing inside a medieval forest, your imagination stops being helpful. Snow begins falling again around midday. At first it seems harmless, light flakes drifting lazily through branches. Then the wind strengthens, visibility shrinks gradually until distant trees fade into pale shadows. The road becomes harder to follow. This frightens the wagon driver more than the wolves. Getting lost during winter travel could become catastrophic with terrifying speed. Roads often lacked proper markers outside important trade routes. Snow buried wheel tracks completely. A wrong turn might lead travellers miles away from shelter without realising it until darkness arrived. The priest quietly suggests stopping early if conditions worsen. Nobody argues. You continue deeper through the forest while cold seeps steadily through layers of wool and fur. Your fingers ache despite gloves. Ice forms along the edges of several travellers' cloaks where melting snow refreezes. Then comes the howl, far away, long and low. Every person stops moving immediately. The sound drifts through the trees with eerie clarity before fading back into silence. You feel something tighten painfully in your stomach. Another howl answers from somewhere farther north. The horses panic slightly now. One pulls against its harness while the wagon creaks sideways in snow. Nobody says much after that. You simply walk faster. A notable historical observation from medieval hunting texts reveals that wolves often followed groups from a distance during severe winters, waiting patiently for weakness or separation. Injured animals, stragglers, children, fear itself probably magnified many encounters, but the possibility remained very real. The snowfall thickens. Soon the world narrows into white haze and dark tree trunks. The group finally reaches a small clearing near dusk where several woodcutters once camped. Half-collapsed shelters lean beneath snowdrifts. Broken logs surround an old fire pit buried beneath ice. It is miserable, which means it is also probably the safest option available. The men unload supplies quickly while daylight disappears behind thick clouds. Wet branches refuse to burn at first. Smoke pours everywhere except upward. One traveller curses softly after slipping on hidden ice beside the wagon wheel. Eventually flames catch. The tiny fire glows weakly against the endless darkness between trees. You huddle close beside the others while stew heats slowly inside a blackened pot. It smells mostly of onions and old turnips. At this point you would probably eat a shoe if someone added enough salt. Night settles heavily across the forest. Then you hear it again. Another howl. Closer now. Conversation dies instantly. The older driver feeds more wood into the fire while staring toward the darkness beyond camp. Nobody wanders far from the flames. Medieval travellers understood something very clearly about winter wilderness. Fire is protection, light is protection, other humans are protection. Everything beyond that circle of warmth belongs to uncertainty. A curious fringe belief survived in some northern regions, claiming wolves feared church bells and holy relics. Certain travellers carried tiny saint medallions specifically during forest crossings. Whether faith comforted people or actually protected them remains another question scholars continue examining. But tonight, beside flickering firelight and towering frozen trees, you understand why frightened travellers clung to every possible source of reassurance. The wind moves softly through the forest canopies. Snow falls steadily, and somewhere beyond the firelight unseen paws continue crunching slowly through the dark. By morning the wolves are gone. At least you think they are. Fresh snow hides most of the tracks surrounding the camp, though one of the servants insists he heard breathing near the edge of the trees sometime during the night. Nobody can confirm it. Nobody really wants to. Medieval travel contains many moments where people silently agree not to investigate disturbing possibilities. The fire has burned low again. You sit close beside the embers, warming stiff hands while weak daylight slowly filters through the forest canopy. Your cloak smells heavily of smoke now. Everything smells of smoke. Hair, blankets, bread only yours, gloves. Medieval winter travellers carried the scent of campfires everywhere like nervous walking chimneys. Breakfast consists of stale bread softened in thin broth. Nobody complains. That is how you know conditions are worsening. The wagon driver studies the pale sky through drifting snow and announces that another storm may arrive before evening. A long silence follows this news. The road ahead remains uncertain, and everyone understands the danger of being trapped between settlements once darkness falls. Shelter becomes the entire purpose of the day. You leave camp quickly. Snow squeaks beneath boots as the group returns to the narrow forest road. Frost clings thickly to tree branches now, coating the woods in pale silver. It would almost look beautiful if you were not freezing steadily from the knees downward. The younger servant walks beside you carrying a lantern despite the daylight. He explains quietly that travellers sometimes vanished entirely along these roads during severe winters. Not murdered, not robbed, simply lost. Snow covered the roads, forests swallowed direction. Bodies were sometimes discovered months later after spring thaw. Cheerful conversation, really? A commonly accepted historical fact is that medieval inns and roadside shelters could be separated by many miles, especially in rural regions. During warmer seasons, this created inconvenience. During winter, it created genuine danger. Travellers timed their journeys carefully around daylight because reaching shelter after sunset became dramatically harder once snowstorms or freezing rain arrived. And of course, weather ignored everyone's schedule completely. By midday, the snowfall begins again. Tiny flakes drift sideways through the trees, while wind pushes steadily against your face. Visibility shrinks little by little. The wagon wheels groan through deepening slush hidden beneath fresh snow. One horse stumbles awkwardly, nearly dragging the cart sideways into a ditch. Everyone stops to steady the animal. The poor thing trembles visibly. You place a hand against its neck and feel warmth rising beneath cold, damp fur. Horses during medieval travel endured astonishing hardship. Long roads, freezing conditions, poor fodder, dangerous terrain. Travellers depended on them completely, while simultaneously exhausting them beyond reason. A peculiar surviving detail from medieval England mentions certain inns hanging bundles of evergreen branches outside during winter to guide travellers through storms. Imagine stumbling half-frozen through blowing snow and spotting pine branches swinging beside a dim lantern. Honestly, that probably felt more emotional than some modern relationships. The forest eventually thins. Ahead lies open countryside buried beneath rolling white fields. Wind sweeps freely across the landscape now with painful intensity. Your cheeks burn from cold exposure. Snow blows into your eyes constantly. The priest pulls his scarf higher and points toward the distant horizon. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No village smoke, no rooftops, no inn, only pale sky melting into endless snow. The wagon driver mutters something unpleasant under his breath. You continue anyway because there is no alternative. Hours pass slowly. Winter travel changes your relationship with time itself. Everything stretches, walking, waiting, hoping. The road seems endless because snow erases familiar landmarks. Distances become difficult to judge. Travellers often feared this strange disorientation almost as much as physical danger. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced harsher winters overall during parts of the so-called Little Ice Age, or whether surviving written records simply emphasized extreme conditions more dramatically. Either way, many travellers described winter landscapes with deep anxiety bordering on dread. You understand why now. The world feels empty in an unsettling way. Even sound behaves differently here. Wind sweeps across open land with long hollow whistles. Snow absorbs smaller noises completely. The cart creaks softly behind you like an old wooden ship trapped at sea. Then suddenly the servant walking ahead stops moving. "There," he whispers. Far ahead, barely visible through falling snow, stands a crooked wooden post. Everyone stares at it hopefully. A road marker. You trudge closer while snow gathers thickly across your boots. The marker leans sideways under ice, nearly buried to its midpoint. Faded symbols carved into the wood point toward two nearby villages. Nearby turns out to mean several more miserable miles. Still, the sign restores morale slightly. At least the road exists. At least someone once travelled this way successfully enough to place a marker here. Medieval winter journeys often depended on tiny reassurances. The wind grows stronger toward evening. Snow blows sideways now in sharp bursts that sting exposed skin. One merchant wraps cloth around his face until only his eyes remain visible. Another keeps glancing nervously toward the fading sky. You begin searching desperately for signs of shelter. Any shelter. An inn, a barn, a stable, a miserable shed occupied by angry chickens. At this point your standards are collapsing beautifully. Then the storm arrives properly. It happens quickly. One moment snow drifts lightly through the air. The next moment, wind roars across the field hard enough to stagger the horses. Visibility drops to a few yards. The road vanishes beneath swirling white. Panic spreads instantly through the group. The wagon driver shouts for everyone to stay together. The horses strain nervously against their harnesses. Snow lashes your face painfully while icy wind tears heat from your body. This is what medieval travellers feared most about winter storms. Not drama, not adventure, simple disappearance. Roads vanish, directions vanish, familiar shapes vanish. Human beings become tiny vulnerable figures wandering aside enormous weather. You can barely hear the others now above the wind. Then through the storm comes another sound. A bell. Faint! Far away.
Everyone freezes listening to desperately.
The bell rings again. A church bell. Hope rushes through the group with almost physical force. You follow the sound slowly across the snow-covered road while wind howls around you. Step by step the bell grows louder. Eventually dark shapes emerge ahead through the storm. Buildings. A village. Tiny cottages huddle together beneath snow-covered roofs, while warm yellow light glows faintly through shuttered windows. Smoke rises from chimneys into the grey evening sky. The church bell continues ringing steadily above the storm, like a guide calling lost souls home. You nearly collapse from relief. Villagers stare cautiously as the group stumbles into the muddy central lane coated in snow and slush. A dog barks somewhere nearby. You smell burning peat and cooking cabbage drifting through the cold air. Not luxurious exactly, but alive. The local inn stands beside the churchyard. Its wooden sign creaks violently in the wind while snow piles against the doorway. Inside, the warmth hits your face so suddenly it almost hurts. Travellers crowd every corner already. Wet cloaks hang beside the fire. Boots steam near glowing embers. Someone sleeps directly on the floor wrapped in blankets. A woman ladles thick stew into wooden bowls while arguing loudly with two merchants over payment. Perfect. You settle beside the fire with aching legs and numb fingers, while snow rattles softly against the shutters outside. And once again you realise the deepest terror of medieval winter journeys was never the road itself. It was the possibility that no welcoming light would appear before darkness finally closed around you. The village disappears behind you by sunrise. Its chimneys fade slowly into the snowy distance while the road bends east toward a frozen river crossing. You already miss the warmth of the inn. The fire, the crowded noise, even the man snoring beside the stew pot like a dying walrus, somehow feels comforting in memory. Now there is only cold air and the steady groan of wagon wheels again. Your boots crunch across hardened snow while pale morning light spreads over the countryside. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world strangely bright beneath fresh frost. Fields glitter under thin sunlight. Bare trees stand motionless beside the road like dark ink marks against white parchment. Beautiful, honestly. Also deeply dangerous. The wagon driver warns everyone that the river ahead may still be frozen. Nobody likes the sound of that sentence. Medieval travellers feared river crossings during winter almost more than mountain roads. Bridges were rare outside major trade routes. Ferries often stopped operating once ice thickened. And frozen rivers carried their own horrifying uncertainty. Ice lies, that is the problem. It looks solid right before it stops being solid. You continue downhill through a shallow valley while breath clouds around the horses' heads. The animals seem reluctant this morning. One repeatedly snorts and shakes ice from its mane. Another limps slightly after yesterday's storm. You notice the merchants checking the harness straps more often now. A detail recorded in several medieval travel chronicles reveals that experienced wagon drivers sometimes tested frozen rivers using long wooden poles before allowing carts onto the surface. Less experienced travellers occasionally skipped this step. History remembers those people briefly. Ahead, the road widens near the riverbank. You finally see the water, or rather, the ice covering it. The river stretches pale grey beneath the winter sky. frozen almost completely from shore to shore. Snow has drifted across the surface in uneven patterns. Here and there, darker patches shimmer faintly beneath thin ice, and
nobody speaks immediately.
The priest quietly makes the sign of the cross. That feels encouraging. The wagon driver kneels near the bank, examining the ice carefully. He taps it several times using the butt of his spear. The sound echoes outward in dull, hollow notes. Not ideal. Still, the turning back would cost precious time and supplies. Nearby bridges may lie many miles away. Winter journeys constantly force terrible choices between danger and greater danger. An established reality of medieval transportation is that rivers functioned like highways during warmer months, but became unpredictable barriers during winter freezes. Some crossings turned easier once thick ice formed. Others became deadly traps where thawing currents weakened the surface invisibly from below. The older merchant squints downstream. "There was a ferry here once," he mutters. You spot the remains eventually. A crooked wooden dock leans half buried beneath snow near the opposite bank. Beside it stands a tiny shack with part of its roof collapsed inward. Empty, silent, probably abandoned until spring. Wonderful again. The group debates crossing for several tense minutes. Wind brushes softly across the frozen river, carrying sharp cold against your cheeks. Somewhere overhead, ravens circle lazily through pale clouds. One servant refuses to step onto the ice at first. "Honestly, Ferris." "Fair enough." Another traveller insists the river looks thick enough near the centre. The priest argues that daylight is wasting away. The horses shuffle anxiously while steam rises from their nostrils. At last, the wagon driver makes the decision. Slowly, single file, no sudden movement. You step onto the ice. Immediately every sound changes. The surface creaks faintly beneath your weight. Snow crunches softly under boots, while dark water moves unseen somewhere below. The river feels strangely alive beneath the frozen shell covering it. You do not enjoy this sensation. The horses move reluctantly behind the group while the wagon wheels groan across packed snow. Everyone walks several feet apart to spread the weight. Nobody speaks louder than a whisper now. Halfway across, the ice cracks. Not completely, just a sharp snapping sound somewhere nearby. Still, your entire body locks with fear. The younger servant stumbles backward. One horse jerks violently sideways against its harness. The wagon tilts enough to send several bundled goods sliding toward the edge. The driver shouts for everyone to stay calm. A difficult request under certain circumstances. You hear another crack beneath the snow. This one longer. A narrow, dark line suddenly appears several yards away across the ice surface before disappearing beneath drifting snow again. The priest starts praying out loud now. Researchers continue discussing how common fatal winter river accidents truly were in medieval Europe, because surviving records usually focused on nobles, clergy, or major disasters. Ordinary travellers vanished with far less documentation. Yet scattered accounts from monasteries and town archives repeatedly mention carts, animals, and merchants lost during winter crossings. You try not to think about that. Step by careful step, the group keeps moving. The opposite bank finally seems closer now, close enough to smell wood smoke drifting faintly from somewhere beyond the trees, close enough to imagine solid ground beneath your feet again. Then comes the sound everyone feared most, a deep booming crack from underneath. One of the rear horses screams. Its front legs punch suddenly through the ice into dark, freezing water below. Chaos erupts instantly. The animal thrashes wildly while the wagon lurches sideways behind it. Ice splinters outward across the river surface. One servant falls to his knees. Another grabs desperately at the horse harness while shouting. You rush backward through swirling snow and panic. The trapped horse kicks violently against broken ice, spraying freezing water across nearby travellers. The sound is horrible, wet, sharp, desperate. The wagon driver hacks at the harness straps with a knife while two others pull at the terrified animal's reins. Beneath the ice you hear rushing water surging through the fractured opening. The horse manages to heave one leg free. Then another. At last the animal crashes trembling back onto solid ice while everyone drags the wagon desperately away from the broken section. The surviving horse nearly collapses from terror afterward, sides heaving heavily in the cold air. Nobody moves for several seconds. Only the river speaks now beneath the ice. Quiet cracking, slow shifting. Hidden water continuing its endless movement below your feet. A strange medieval belief from parts of Scandinavia claimed certain rivers possessed spirits that demanded offerings during dangerous crossings. Travellers occasionally tossed coins or scraps of bread onto the ice for protection. Standing here now, staring at black water seeping through fractured ice, you understand how people arrived at such ideas surprisingly fast. The group reaches the opposite bank, shaken and exhausted. One servant vomits quietly beside the ruined tatty dock. The soaked horse trembles violently while steam rises from its wet fur into the freezing air. The wagon driver orders blankets wrapped around the animal immediately. If it freezes tonight, the journey may already be doomed. You glance back across the river. Snow drifts softly over the cracked surface now, slowly covering signs of what nearly happened. By tomorrow the crossing may look harmless again, clean, silent, innocent. That is the frightening thing about winter roads. Danger rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath your feet while the world around you appears calm and beautiful and perfectly still. The soaked horse survives the night. Barely. You wake before dawn inside a crowded stable where travellers and animals share warmth beneath one leaking roof. The air smells overpoweringly of hay, wet fur, smoke and manure. Somewhere nearby a cow shifts heavily in its stall. One of the merchants snores beneath a pile of blankets while clutching his money pouch against his chest like a treasured child, which, honestly, says a lot about medieval merchants. The rescued horse stands near the far wall wrapped in rough wool coverings. Steam still rises faintly from its body whenever cold air slips through cracks in the stable boards. The wagon driver checks the animal repeatedly with exhausted eyes. Losing a horse during winter travel could destroy an entire journey. Outside, the village remains silent beneath fresh snow. You hear only distant wind and the occasional barking dog. Pale blue light slowly spreads across the frozen rooftops while villagers begin lighting morning fires inside their cottages. Thin smoke drifts upward through the cold, still air. The group prepares quietly for departure. Nobody mentions yesterday's river crossing very much. Medieval travellers often treated near disaster with strange practicality. There was rarely time for emotional recovery. Roads continued, supplies dwindled, weather worsened regardless of personal feelings. So you eat hard bread dipped in weak ale and continue onward. The road ahead cuts through low hills scattered with leafless trees and abandoned fields. Snow crunches beneath boots while wagon wheels grind slowly through frozen mud hidden under the surface. The horses move cautiously this morning. Even the animals seem less confident now. The priest walks beside you in silence for a while before speaking softly. You should keep your purse hidden. Not exactly comforting advice. Bandits remained a constant fear across many medieval roads, particularly during winter, when isolated travellers became more vulnerable and local economies struggled through shortages. Contrary to romantic legends, most robbers were not charming outlaws with dramatic speeches and excellent hair. They were desperate people, former soldiers, hungry peasants, criminal groups hiding near trade routes, sometimes even local officials abusing authority in remote regions. A surviving legal record from 14th century France describes thieves disguising themselves as travellers, stranded by snowstorms in order to gain trust before robbing passing merchants, which is a deeply unpleasant reminder that hospitality and suspicion often travelled together during medieval winters. The wagon driver orders the group closer together. Nobody objects. You pass several abandoned cottages near midday. Their roofs sag beneath snowdrifts while broken fences disappear into white fields nearby. One chimney has partially collapsed inward. Another cottage door hangs open crookedly in the wind. The younger servant stares nervously at the empty buildings. "Famine," he whispers. "Possibly. War, disease, poor harvests, brutal winters. Or migration could empty small settlements surprisingly quickly during the medieval period. Entire villages sometimes vanished after years of hardship. Travellers moving through remote regions encountered these silent places more often than historians once believed. And empty villages create terrible feelings. You keep expecting movement behind shattered windows. A figure, a face, anything. Instead, there is only wind brushing softly through dead grass beneath the snow. By afternoon, the sky darkens again with heavy clouds. Not another storm exactly, but enough to dull the weak sunlight into grey haze. The road narrows between rocky hills where scattered pine trees cling stubbornly to frozen ground. The wagon slows. The older merchant glances repeatedly toward the hillsides now. You notice it too eventually. Too quiet. No birds, no woodcutters, no farms nearby. The perfect place for an ambush, unfortunately. One accepted truth of medieval road travel is that many robberies occurred in isolated terrain where escape proved difficult. Narrow passes, forest paths, bridges, and ravines offered ideal opportunities for thieves watching trade routes carefully. You suddenly remember the priest warning you about your purse. Wonderful timing again. The group continues carefully around a bend in the road. Then you see them, 3 figures standing farther ahead beside the snowy path. Men, wrapped in dark cloaks, motionless. Every traveller stops immediately. The wind moves softly across the hills while snowflakes drift between both groups. One of the strangers raises a hand slowly, not waving exactly, more like signalling for the wagon to halt. Nobody likes this. The older driver grips the horse reins tighter, while another servant quietly lifts his spear. The priest mutters something beneath his breath that sounds very much like prayer. One stranger steps forward. He claims they are travellers stranded after losing their horse during the storm several days earlier. He asks for food and perhaps a ride toward the next village. Reasonable enough, except for one detail. You notice a sword beneath his cloak. Then another. The second man carries a hatchet at his belt. The third never stops watching the wagon. A curious detail from certain medieval court records suggests some robber bands deliberately appeared half frozen or injured to lower travellers' guard before attacking at close range. Human deception has always been depressingly creative. Nobody moves. Snow falls quietly around the tense little gathering. The wagon driver finally answers that there is no room on the cart. His voice remains calm, though his hand rests near the knife at his side now. The stranger smiles faintly, not warmly. Then he steps closer anyway. The horses react instantly, pulling nervously against their harnesses. One servant lowers his spear toward the road. The priest raises a small wooden cross almost instinctively. For several long seconds nothing happens. Then somewhere far behind you comes the sound of approaching bells and wagon wheels. Another caravan. The strangers hear it too. Everything changes immediately. The lead man steps backward. His expression hardens briefly before smoothing again into false politeness. He mutters something about finding shelter elsewhere. Then the 3 figures disappear quickly across the snowy hillside between scattered trees. Gone. Just like that. Nobody breathes properly until the distant caravan finally appears along the road behind you. 6 wagons, armed guards, more horses than you have seen in days. Relief spreads visibly through your group. Many medieval merchants preferred travelling in larger caravans during dangerous seasons precisely because numbers discouraged attacks. Winter roads isolated smaller groups too easily. Safety often depended less on weapons and more on avoiding becoming an easy target. You join the larger caravan by late afternoon. The atmosphere changes almost immediately. More noise, more conversation, more firewood available during rest stops. One wagon carries barrels of salted fish that smell absolutely catastrophic. Another transports dyed cloth covered carefully against moisture. A grey-bearded trader tells stories while walking beside you through the snow. He claims some bandits scattered caltrops across frozen roads to injure horses before robbing stranded travellers. Another man insists robbers occasionally dressed as monks to approach wagons without suspicion. Whether every tale is true hardly matters now. Winter roads have taught you something already. Fear grows naturally in isolated places. As darkness approaches, the combined caravan reaches a fortified roadside inn surrounded by wooden palisades. Lantern light glows warmly through narrow windows while armed watchmen stand beside the gate. Safe, or at least safer. Inside the courtyard, travellers crowd around fires while guards secure the gates against the night. Horses snort softly from nearby stables. Snow settles quietly across wagon tops and boot prints. You sit beside the flames, listening to distant laughter echo through the inn yard. And somewhere beyond those walls, hidden among frozen hills and darkening roads, desperate men still wander the winter landscape searching for vulnerable travellers who never reach shelter in time. The fortified inn fades behind the caravan as another bitter morning begins. Snow has stopped for now, though the sky still hangs low and grey above the road. Frost coats the wagon wheels in pale crusted layers. Horses breathe thick clouds into the cold air while traders tighten ropes around cargo stiffened by ice. You wake hungry. Not ordinary hungry either. Medieval winter travel introduces a deeper kind of hunger that settles slowly into your bones, the sort that makes every smell feel personal. Every cooking fire becomes emotionally overwhelming. You would probably cry over warm soup at this point. Breakfast does not help much. A chunk of dark bread, a little smoked fish, thin ale that tastes faintly of wet wood and regret. Still, you eat every crumb. One thing modern people often underestimate is how difficult winter nutrition became during long medieval journeys. Fresh food spoiled or froze, roads slowed supply wagons. Villages struggled with shortages near the end of winter months. Travellers relied heavily on preserved food that could survive cold conditions and rough transport. Which means endless salt. Salted meat, salted fish, hard cheese, dried peas, bread hard enough to survive minor warfare. Your stomach misses vegetables desperately. The larger caravan moves at a steady pace through rolling countryside where snow covers harvested fields in smooth white layers. Bare orchards stand frozen beside distant cottages. Occasionally you pass farmers splitting wood or hauling water through the cold morning air. Most villagers stare openly at the caravan. Travellers bring news, goods, disease, gossip, and trouble all together. Medieval roads connected communities while also making them uneasy. Outsiders carried uncertainty wherever they went. The bearded trader beside you tears off a piece of dried sausage with his teeth. Never trust winter roads after noon, he says casually. You ask why? Because hunger gets louder. That answer stays with you longer than expected. By midday the wind sharpens again. The caravan slows while crossing muddy stretches where packed snow has begun melting into deep brown slush. Wagon wheels sink heavily into the road. Men strain beside the carts, pushing through thick mud that smells of wet earth and horse dung. Every movement drains energy. You notice people speaking less now. Travellers save strength instinctively during difficult stretches. Even conversation costs effort when your body remains cold all day. A fascinating little account from medieval Italy describes merchants carrying roasted chestnuts inside their gloves during winter travel to keep their hands warm while also preserving a snack for later. Honestly, that might be the smartest thing anyone has done in the entire Middle Ages. The road climbs gradually toward a wooded ridge. You chew slowly on dried apples purchased from the fortified inn yesterday. They taste sour and leathery but wonderfully alive compared to salted meat. Nearby, one younger servant sucks melted snow from a strip of cloth because the water barrels partially froze overnight. That creates another constant winter fear. Clean water. Streams freeze. Wells become difficult to access. Snow must be melted carefully over fires. Travellers sometimes drank weak ale because it remained safer than questionable water sources along remote roads. Medieval beer was usually weaker than modern versions. though drinking it constantly during exhausting winter marches probably still created some memorable decision-making. The caravan halts briefly near an abandoned shrine beside the road. Its small stone roof leans crookedly beneath snow while faded painted saints stare outward from cracked walls. Several travellers kneel there to pray before continuing uphill. Others simply eat, quietly. You realise food has become the centre of everyone's thinking. Who still has bread left? Which villages may sell oats? Whether the next inn serves stew or only stale cheese? Hunger follows medieval travellers constantly during winter. Not starvation exactly, more like a slow draining weakness that never fully disappears. The older wagon driver shares strips of smoked eel with several servants. One man nearly burns his fingers snatching a hot turnip from the cooking pot during a roadside stop. Nobody laughs because everyone understands perfectly. Specialists examining surviving household records from Northern Europe often point out how carefully medieval communities rationed food through winter months. By late winter, supplies could become dangerously thin, especially after failed harvests or severe storms. And you are still travelling through all this, which means your meals depend entirely on what strangers are willing to sell. As evening approaches, snow begins falling lightly again. Not enough for a storm. Just enough to deepen the cold and coat everyone's cloaks in white powder. The caravan presses onward toward a village marked on older trade maps. The bearded merchant claims they will find warm food there. At this stage you would follow him through volcanic lava for soup. Darkness arrives early. The road finally descends toward a cluster of cottages gathered beside a frozen pond. Smoke curls from chimneys into the fading sky while lantern light flickers behind shuttered windows. Dogs bark as the caravan approaches. The inn looks crowded already. Of course it does. Winter roads funnel travellers toward the same few safe shelters night after night. Space becomes precious. Warmth becomes currency. Inside, the common room feels thick with heat and noise. Wet wool hangs beside the fire. Traders argue over prices while exhausted travellers crowd shoulder to shoulder along wooden benches. And then you smell it, stew, rich cabbage stew with onions and bits of pork floating through rising steam. You nearly ascend spiritually. Bowls arrive slowly because the kitchen struggles to feed everyone packed inside the inn tonight. One woman complains loudly that travellers from the south ate most of the bread already. Another man guards his bowl with suspicious intensity. You understand him. A charmingly odd note from one medieval German traveller mentions people carrying personal wooden spoons tied directly to their belts because inns did not always provide utensils. Imagine surviving wolves, rivers, and bandits only to lose a fight over soup equipment. You finally receive your bowl, the stew tastes incredible. Readable. Probably because your standards have collapsed completely after days of cold roads and preserved food. Still, the warmth spreads through your body almost painfully at first. Your frozen hand shakes slightly while holding the wooden bowl close to your chest. Around you, the inn settles gradually into tired evening rhythms. A horse trader snores beside the wall before finishing his meal. A priest reads quietly near the firelight. Two merchants whisper over account books while counting coins beneath the table. And everywhere you look, people eat carefully, slowly, protectively. Because medieval winter travellers understood something simple and deeply human. Cold alone rarely defeated you. But cold combined with hunger could hollow a person out day by day until even walking became difficult. Roads stretched longer, fear sharpened, tempers frayed, hope faded more easily. Outside, two drift softly across the dark village lanes. Inside, you scrape the last bits of stew from the bottom of the bowl while savouring every final mouthful like treasure. Tomorrow the road waits again. But tonight, at least for a few precious hours, your stomach is full and the winter darkness remains outside the inn walls where it belongs. Morning comes with the sound of horses coughing. Not ordinary little snorts either. Deep strained noises echoing through the frosty stable yard behind the inn. You pull your cloak tighter and step outside into the pale dawn where stable boys move between the animals carrying buckets of half-frozen water. The rescued horse from the river crossing looks worse today. Its coat hangs damp and uneven despite yesterday's blankets. One front leg trembles slightly whenever it shifts weight. The wagon driver runs weathered hands along the animal's neck with growing concern. "Noble." But he says it in a loud yet reasonable. But everyone understands the danger. You've spent days worrying about wolves, rivers, and bandits. Now another fear settles over the caravan quietly and heavily. Losing a horse during medieval winter travel could unravel everything. The caravan leaves the village slowly beneath low clouds. Snow squeals beneath wagon wheels hardened by overnight frost. Your breath curls white through the cold air while the horses strain against their harnesses. The injured animal limps almost immediately. That sound follows you mile after mile. Clop, drag. Clop, drag. A large part of medieval transportation depended entirely on animal endurance. Horses pulled carts, carried riders, hauled supplies, and determined how far travellers could move before darkness arrived. In winter conditions, their labour became even more exhausting because roads turned muddy, icy, or deeply snow-covered. And unlike modern vehicles, exhausted horses could not simply refuel at convenient roadside stations selling disappointing sandwiches. They broke down slowly and tragically in front of you. The road bends through broad open farmland where frozen ponds glitter beneath weak sunlight. Farmers wrapped in thick wool layers guide oxen through snowy fields while smoke rises from distant cottages. The younger servant beside you keeps glancing nervously at the limping horse. "If it dies," he whispers, "we leave half the cargo behind." Nobody corrects him. One merchant overhears the conversation and immediately begins recalculating profit losses under his breath. Medieval traders possessed remarkable talent for worrying about money during potential disaster. The injured horse stumbles again before noon. This time the wagon jerks sideways hard enough to spill part of a grain sack into the snow. Several men rush forward, steadying the animal while cold wind sweeps across the road. You place a hand against the horse's flank. It feels hot beneath the fur despite the freezing air. A travel journal written by a Flemish merchant once described horses as the fragile heartbeat of the road, which sounds surprisingly poetic for someone who probably smelled constantly of wet leather and onions. The caravan stops beside a cluster of bare trees while the driver examines the animal more carefully. Snow drifts lazily around the group. The horse lowers its head and breathes heavily through flared nostrils. The priest murmurs that perhaps the river water chilled it too deeply. Another man suggests damaged muscles. A third recommends rubbing garlic into the horse's legs. Medieval veterinary medicine was an adventurous field emotionally powered by confidence rather than consistent results. Some surviving manuals advise feeding horses warm wine mixtures during winter exhaustion. Others recommended herbal poultices or heated stones wrapped in cloth. A few treatments probably helped. Others likely confused the horse profoundly. The caravan continues at reduced pace. Now everyone walks more quietly. Because when an animal weakens on winter roads, people begin imagining themselves stranded. You picture snowstorms arriving while the cart sits immobile beside an empty road, supplies running low, wolves returning from the forest shadows. Fear spreads easily once movement slows. The afternoon sky darkens towards silver grey again. A cold breeze rattles dead branches overhead, while the caravan reaches rougher terrain filled with frozen ruts and hidden stones. The injured horse struggles constantly now. Sweat darkens its fur despite the cold weather. Then suddenly it collapses. The entire wagon lurches violently. Wood creaks. One merchant falls sideways into the snow with an extremely unheroic yelp. The horse crashes onto its side, trembling hard against the frozen ground. For several long seconds, nobody moves. The animal tries to rise once, fails, tries again. Its legs slide helplessly beneath it. The driver kneels beside the horse with grim, exhausted eyes. Steam rises around them both in the freezing air. One servant strokes the animal's neck softly, while another looks away toward the empty fields. You realize something unsettling then. Every traveller here understands animals emotionally and practically at the same time. They care about the horse, truly, but they also fear what its failure means for everyone else. Researchers examining medieval account books have noticed how valuable healthy horses remained compared with many ordinary labourers. Good animals cost fortunes. Entire trade journeys depended on them surviving rough roads and brutal weather. The driver finally stands. He says the horse cannot continue. Silence follows. No dramatic speeches, no arguments, just tired acceptance settling across the caravan like fresh snowfall. The merchants begin redistributing cargo immediately. Bundles move between wagons. Ropes tighten. Weight calculations matter now more than comfort. Every remaining horse must pull harder through winter terrain. You help unload sacks while numb fingers ache in the cold. Nearby, the injured horse lies quietly beneath drifting snowflakes. A strangely specific custom recorded in parts of medieval Germany involved travellers touching a horse's mane for luck before difficult journeys. Some believed animals sensed danger long before humans recognised it. Looking at this exhausted creature now, you understand why people form such attachments. The caravan leaves the horse with a nearby farming family after paying several coins and part of a grain sack. Whether the animal survives winter remains uncertain. Nobody asks directly. The road feels heavier afterward. You continue onward beneath fading daylight while fewer horses strain against overloaded wagons. Progress slows noticeably. Wheels sink deeper into frozen mud. Men push harder beside the carts. And all the while another fear lingers quietly in your thoughts. What happens if another horse falls? By evening snow begins again, thin and dry like pale dust swirling through the darkening air. The caravan finally reaches a roadside shelter used mostly by traders moving between larger towns. Shelter is a generous word. It resembles a long wooden barn with smoke leaking through holes in the roof. Still warmth glows faintly from inside. You enter alongside exhausted travellers and immediately smell damp hay. Onions cooking in fat, wet boots drying near fires, and animals packed together for warmth. Several strangers already sleep against the walls wrapped in cloaks. One old merchant near the fire tells stories while repairing a leather harness. He describes winter journeys where entire caravans became stranded after losing too many animals on mountain roads. Another traveller recalls seeing merchants pull carts themselves through snow after horses froze during a blizzard. Nobody doubts these stories, because after days on medieval roads, they no longer sound exaggerated. You settle near the fire, listening to horses shifting restlessly outside the shelter walls. Their hooves crunch softly against frozen ground. Chains rattle occasionally in the dark. The sound becomes strangely comforting. Alive. Still moving. Still carrying you through a winter world where survival often depended not on bravery or strength, but on whether exhausted animals could take a few more steps before the snow closed around the road again. The road grows busier as you travel south. Not crowded exactly. Medieval winter roads rarely become lively places, but now you begin passing small groups moving in the same direction. Men wrapped in patched cloaks carrying wooden staffs. Elderly women riding slow donkeys beneath layers of wool blankets. Families dragging handcarts through the snow with determined, exhausted faces. Pilgrim. You first notice them properly at dawn while leaving the roadside shelter behind. Frost still clings to the fields. Thin sunlight glimmers across frozen puddles beside the road. Ahead, a line of travellers moves slowly through the cold morning haze, while distant church bells drift faintly over the countryside. The priest walking with your caravan nods toward them knowingly. Saint's feast day approaches. Apparently this explains everything. Religious travel remained deeply important throughout medieval Europe despite terrible weather, dangerous roads, and the constant possibility of disease or robbery. Pilgrims journeyed toward shrines seeking healing, forgiveness, miracles, or spiritual comfort. Some travelled because they chose to. Others travelled because courts or church authorities ordered them to. Imagine receiving punishment that basically says, "Congratulations, now go freeze on medieval roads for several months." The caravan eventually catches up with one larger pilgrim group near midday. Their clothing varies wildly, some wear thick fur-lined cloaks, others look painfully underprepared for winter conditions. A few carry tiny badges sewn onto hats or satchels showing symbols from previous holy sites. One young pilgrim walks barefoot despite the snow. You stare at him in disbelief. Apparently acts of physical suffering sometimes formed part of religious devotion. Certain pilgrims believed enduring cold, hunger, and discomfort brought spiritual merit or demonstrated repentance. Meanwhile, your own spiritual journey currently involves fantasizing about warm stew. A surviving account from Canterbury describes pilgrims attaching small bells to staffs during winter journeys, so companions could hear one another in fog or snowstorms. The image feels strangely peaceful until you remember those bells probably echoed through freezing darkness while everyone worried about wolves and frostbite. The caravan slows slightly as roads become more crowded. Pilgrims speak quietly among themselves while trudging through snow. Some recite prayers beneath visible breaths. Others simply stare ahead with the exhausted concentration of people who stopped thinking beyond the next mile hours ago. You begin noticing the sounds of winter travel more clearly now. Leather creaking, boots crunching, wheels grinding against frozen mud, someone coughing endlessly farther back along the road, a child crying briefly before falling silent again. All of it drifts together beneath the pale sky like one long tired procession moving across the season itself. The priest beside you exchanges greetings with several passing travellers. One older woman asks how far remains to the shrine ahead. Another requests prayers for a sick son left behind at home. Even on difficult roads, pilgrimage created temporary communities among strangers. Shared hardship softened social boundaries in curious ways. Merchants walked beside peasants. Nobles sometimes travelled beside labourers. Everyone became cold together eventually. Though admittedly some people became cold in far more expensive boots. Snow begins falling lightly during the afternoon. The pilgrims continue anyway. A few begin singing quietly. The sound surprises you. Thin wavering voices drifting across white fields beneath overcast skies. Not cheerful exactly, but more steady. Enduring, like people using music to keep themselves moving through cold air and aching feet. One historical source from northern France mentions pilgrims carrying small bags of dried herbs near their faces during winter travel, because a strong scent supposedly protected against sickness and foul air. Lavender, rosemary, juniper. Whether this actually worked medically remains uncertain, but honestly, anything improving the smell of medieval roads deserved appreciation. The caravan stops briefly beside a roadside chapel near sunset. Pilgrims crowd inside, immediately seeking warmth and prayer. Candles flicker softly against painted wooden saints darkened by years of smoke. Melted snow drips from cloaks onto stone floors. The air smells of wax, damp wool, and cold earth. You sit near the doorway watching tired travellers rest. One elderly man rubs swollen feet carefully beside the wall. A young mother feeds watered wine to a coughing child wrapped tightly in blankets. Nearby, two brothers argue softly over directions while trying to read faded markings on a pilgrim map. Winter pilgrimage sounds romantic in paintings. In reality, it mostly looks exhausting. Researchers still examine how many medieval pilgrims travelled primarily from religious devotion versus practical motives like trade, migration, or social obligation. Human motivations rarely stay neat and simple. A person might seek forgiveness and business opportunities simultaneously while freezing beside a muddy road. Honestly, that feels very human. Outside the chapel, darkness thickens quickly. The caravan and pilgrims eventually continue together toward a monastery rumoured to offer shelter nearby. Snowflakes swirl through lantern light while everyone presses onward across the fading road. Then the wind rises sharply. Not a storm yet. Just enough to make the open field suddenly bitter and hostile again. Travellers lower heads against the cold. One child begins crying from exhaustion. The barefoot pilgrim stumbles visibly now, though he refuses assistance. You start understanding another hidden fear of medieval winter journeys. Not dramatic death, not attacks, just physical collapse. The slow moment when a person's body simply refuses to continue. The monastery finally appears after nightfall. A dark stone complex standing atop a low hill with warm golden light glowing through narrow windows. Bells ring softly somewhere inside while smoke rises from multiple chimneys into the snowy night. Relief spreads through the travellers almost instantly. Monasteries often provided vital refuge along difficult medieval routes, especially for pilgrims and poorer travellers unable to afford expensive inns. Hospitality carried religious importance, though conditions still varied enormously between regions. Tonight this place feels magnificent. The heavy wooden gates open slowly. Warmth spills outward. Inside the courtyard, monks guide weary travellers towards long halls crowded with benches and straw bedding. Huge cooking pots steam beside roaring fires. The smell alone nearly makes you emotional again. Onion soup, fresh bread, hot broth simmering with herbs. Pilgrims kneel briefly in gratitude before eating. Others skip directly to the food with admirable honesty. You settle near the fire while snow taps softly against the monastery windows. Around you, exhausted travellers unwrap frozen scarves, dry-soaked gloves, and stretch aching legs toward the heat. One monk moves through the hall distributing warm-watered wine flavoured with spices. Another checks on elderly pilgrims resting beside the walls. Outside, winter darkness swallows the roads completely. But here, inside stone walls and candlelight, surrounded by strangers sharing food and warmth, the fear loosens slightly from your chest. For tonight at least the journey pauses, and somewhere beyond the monastery gates, lonely roads continue winding through snow and forest beneath the endless medieval winter sky. You leave the monastery beneath a sky the colour of dull iron. Snowflakes drift lazily through the cold morning air while bells echo softly behind you across the hills. Pilgrims gather their belongings slowly in the courtyard. Monks hand out rough bread and final blessings before the travellers disappear once more onto the winter roads. The caravan turns northeast toward the mountains. Everyone seems less cheerful about this than the monks were. At first the road rises gently through pine forest dusted with snow. Thin streams run beneath crusts of ice beside the trail. The air smells cleaner here somehow. Sharper, colder. Each breath stings your lungs slightly. Then the hills become steeper. The wagons slow almost immediately. Mountain travel during medieval winters frightened even experienced travellers because weather changed brutally fast at higher elevations. Narrow paths vanished beneath drifting snow. Rock slides blocked roads. Ice-coated dangerous ledges without warning, and avalanches remained terrifyingly unpredictable. You had hoped nobody would mention avalanches. Unfortunately, the bearded trader begins discussing them before noon with the enthusiasm of a man describing local sports statistics. A mountain guide joins the caravan at a small settlement near the foothills. He wears heavy furs and carries a long wooden staff tipped with iron. His beard contains actual frost. You trust him immediately because he looks exactly like someone who has survived unpleasant weather repeatedly. He studies the sky often while leading the caravan uphill. "Too much fresh snow," he mutters once. "Wonderful again." A number of medieval trade routes crossed dangerous alpine regions despite severe winter conditions because merchants, messengers, and pilgrims could not always wait for spring. Some passes remained active year-round depending on local economies and political needs. Travellers accepted enormous risks simply because entire communities depended on goods continuing to move through the mountains. You begin climbing steadily through narrowing valleys where towering cliffs rise dark above the snowy road. Wind whistles between stone walls carrying loose snow across the path in ghostly swirls. The wagons creak heavily uphill. Men push from behind while horses strain against their harnesses. Every breath becomes visible instantly in the freezing air. Your legs ache constantly now from climbing through packed snow. The mountain guide suddenly raises one hand. Everyone stop. No one asks why. The silence here feels different from the forests earlier in your journey. Heavier somehow. The mountains absorb sound strangely beneath thick snow. Even wagon wheels seem quieter now. Then you hear it. A distant rumbling. Soft at first, almost like thunder very far away. The guide listens carefully before relaxing slightly. Far ridge, he says. That does not actually comfort anyone. One unusual custom recorded in alpine regions involved travellers tying strips of cloth to mountain shrines before dangerous crossings. Some believed the mountains contained spirits angered by loud noises or arrogance. Considering avalanches can literally punish both of those things, the superstition starts sounding oddly practical. The road narrows further during the afternoon. To your left rises solid rock covered in ice. To your right, the land drops steeply into a snowy ravine filled with pine trees far below. One wrong wagon movement here would end the journey very quickly. You avoid looking down. The horses snort nervously while iron shoes scrape against frozen ground. Every few minutes, chunks of snow slide from cliffs overhead with muffled thumps. Nobody speaks loudly anymore. The guide orders the caravan to cross one exposed slope in complete silence. Apparently vibrations and echoes sometimes worried mountain travellers during heavy snow conditions. Whether silence truly prevented avalanches remains debated among historians studying alpine folklore and medieval travel practices. But when you stand beneath towering snow-covered cliffs, whispering suddenly feels like an excellent idea regardless. So the caravan moves quietly. Only wind, only breathing. Only boots crunching through snow. You become painfully aware of every sound your body makes. Cloth shifting, teeth clicking together from cold, the tiny rattle of metal buckles against leather straps. Then halfway across the slope, one horse slips. The animal stumbles sideways with a sharp cry while the wagon behind it jerks dangerously toward the ravine edge. Snow sprays beneath scrambling hooves. Several men rush forward, grabbing ropes and wheel supports desperately. For one terrible moment, the entire wagon tilts toward open emptiness. Then it steadies. Everyone freezes afterward, breathing hard into the cold air. The guide motions urgently forward. Keep moving. Do not stop here. You obey instantly. By late afternoon, snow begins falling harder. Thick flakes swirl between dark cliffs, while the mountain path twists higher into fog and drifting white haze. Visibility shrinks alarmingly fast. The guide finally leads the caravan toward a rough stone shelter built against the mountainside. Calling it a building feels generous. It resembles a pile of rocks with a roof tempting optimism. Still, smoke stains above the entrance suggest travellers use it regularly. Inside, the shelter feels crowded almost immediately. Fires burn low within shallow stone pits while damp travellers squeeze beside one another wrapped in blankets and cloaks. The ceiling leaks melted snow steadily into wooden buckets, and yet it feels glorious. Outside, the wind howls across the mountain pass with growing violence. You warm frozen hands beside the fire while listening to other travellers exchange stories about winter crossings. One merchant claims he once saw an avalanche bury an entire mule train near the Italian border. Another insists mountain spirits whistle before storms arrive. A monk quietly states that exhaustion causes people to imagine strange things at high elevations. The bearded trader replies that the exhaustion probably created half of civilization. Fair point, honestly. Documents from medieval mountain monasteries occasionally mention travellers arriving half frozen and nearly snowblind after losing paths during storms. Some shelters kept emergency stores of wood or dried food specifically because mountain weather trapped people unexpectedly for days at a time. You understand that fear completely now. Night settles over the mountains early. Wind rattles the shelter walls while snow hisses across the roof outside. Every so often, distant rumbling echoes somewhere beyond the darkness. Nobody asks whether it is thunder. You lie wrapped tightly in blankets, listening to the storm. Beside you, exhausted travellers breathe heavily in sleep while fires crackle softly against the cold. The mountain guide remains awake near the doorway, watching the weather through narrow gaps in the stone wall. Because here, among frozen peaks and endless snowfields, medieval travellers feared something enormous and merciless. Not enemies, not hunger. The mountain itself, silent, ancient, and always waiting above the road. You wake during the night because someone is groaning. At first you think it is the wind pushing against the stone shelter walls again. Then you hear coughing, wet and painful. A traveller near the far side of the room curls beneath blankets while another man pours water from a wooden cup into shaking hands. The fire burns low. Smoke drifts heavily through the cramped shelter because the chimney barely functions. Your eyes sting slightly. Around you, exhausted travellers sleep in awkward tangled positions beside packs, boots, and damp cloaks spread near the heat. Outside, the mountains remain buried beneath darkness and snow. Inside, another danger quietly spreads among the travellers. Sickness. Winter journeys punish the human body constantly. Cold-weakened people, damp clothing, irritated skin and lungs, crowded inns and shelters packed strangers close together for warmth, allowing illness to move easily from person to person. Medieval travellers feared disease partly because medicine offered so few reliable answers, and because getting sick on the road trapped you frighteningly fast. Morning arrives grey and bitterly cold. The coughing man looks worse now. His face shines pale with sweat despite the freezing air. Another traveller complains that his feet have gone numb since yesterday's climb. A third winces while removing one boot beside the fire. You glance downward. His toes look distinctly pale. Nobody comments on it directly. The mountain guide studies the weather outside before announcing the pass remains open enough to travel, so the caravan prepares slowly, stiffly, reluctantly. One monk from the monastery travelling with the group crushes herbs into steaming water for the feverish man. Whether the mixture truly helps remains unclear, but medieval medicine frequently relied on herbal remedies, warmed wine, prayer, and hopeful observation. Sometimes that was enough. Often it was not. A physician from the period once wrote that winter, travellers should avoid sleeping immediately after heavy meals because cold air and full stomachs supposedly encouraged illness. Medieval medical theory linked health to balances inside the body rather than germs, which nobody understood yet. Still, modern people also make questionable health decisions during travel, so perhaps humanity has not evolved quite as impressively as we imagine. The caravan resumes climbing through the mountains. Snow squeaks beneath boots in the sharp cold. Wind sweeps powdery drifts across the narrow road while pale clouds move low above the peaks. Your fingers ache almost immediately despite thick gloves. The coughing traveller rides inside one wagon now wrapped beneath blankets. Every few minutes another rough coughing fit shakes through the cart. The sound unsettles everyone. Disease during medieval travel carried terrifying uncertainty because symptoms often blurred together. Fever, chills, swollen joints, infected wounds, lung sickness, stomach illness. Travellers possessed few ways to separate temporary exhaustion from deadly conditions until it became too late. You notice several people quietly avoiding the sick man's wagon already. Not cruelly, carefully. Roadside fear changes social behaviour quickly. A surviving monastery record from the Alps mentions travellers warming stones beside fires and wrapping them in cloth to place against freezing feet at night. You try this yourself during a midday stop and immediately understand why the practice survived. Your feet currently feel like hostile objects attached to your legs. The caravan pauses beside a rocky outcrop where wind cannot reach as fiercely. Travellers eat cold bread and dried meat while snow drifts around them. One servant removes his boot again and quietly curses beneath his breath. Blisters. The skin along his heel looks all raw and broken. Walking injuries became constant companions during medieval journeys. Wet boots rubbed endlessly against skin, frost-hardened leather until it cracked. Simple wounds easily became infected without proper cleaning or rest, and medieval roads offered remarkably little rest. The mountain guide warns everyone to keep moving during stops. Cold climbs into still bodies, he says. That sentence feels unpleasantly accurate. By afternoon, the caravan reaches the highest part of the pass. Snow stretches endlessly across jagged ridges, disappearing into white mist. Wind howls across exposed slopes hard enough to steal breath from your lungs. The coughing traveller worsens. You hear him retching weakly inside the wagon while the monk wipes his forehead with damp cloth. Nearby, another merchant limps badly from swollen knees. Everyone looks tired now. Not ordinary travel tiredness. Winter sickness, exhaustion, the kind settling behind people's eyes. Several scholars studying medieval climate and health note that long cold seasons likely intensified respiratory illness and weakened nutrition across travelling populations. A journey that already strained healthy bodies became far more dangerous once sickness entered the group. You see it spreading emotionally now too. People speak less, laugh less, watch one another more carefully. As evening approaches, snow begins falling thick and wet. The guide urges the caravan downhill toward lower elevations before darkness fully arrives. The road twists dangerously along icy ridges, while fading light turns the mountains blue-grey around you. Then another traveller collapses. Not dramatically. He simply sits down in the snow beside the road and refuses to rise again. Everyone stops. The man insists he only needs rest, but his hands shake violently while his face burns red with fever. Steam rises from his body into the freezing air. The monk kneels beside him with growing concern. You suddenly realise how thin the line between exhaustion and catastrophe truly is out here. A minor fever inside a warm village might pass quietly unsaid. A fever in the mountains becomes something far more frightening. One curious belief from parts of Central Europe claimed mountain air itself carried illness during winter storms. Travellers sometimes covered their mouths with scented cloth or chewed pine needles while crossing high passes. The pine needles probably tasted terrible. But right now, almost every survival method sounds reasonable. Darkness approach quickly. At last, the caravan reaches a small hospice maintained by religious brothers near the lower slopes. Lantern light glows warmly through narrow windows while smoke rises from sturdy chimneys into the snowy evening. The building feels miraculous. Inside, warmth rushes across your frozen skin almost painfully. Fires crackle in large hearths. The smell of broth and medicinal herbs fills the air. Simple wooden beds line the walls where previous travellers already rest beneath blankets. The brothers move efficiently among the arrivals. Wet boots removed. Hot water heated. Herbal drinks distributed. The feverish travellers separated from the healthier ones near another room. You settle beside the fire while exhaustion drags heavily through your body. Nearby, the coughing man breathes unevenly beneath blankets while one brother quietly prays over him. Outside, the mountains vanish slowly into snow and darkness. Inside the hospice, weary travellers stretch aching feet toward the flames and hope their bodies remain strong enough for whatever winter roads still wait ahead. Because medieval travellers understood a terrifying truth very well. Sometimes the greatest danger was not the road itself. It was your own body failing while the journey continued anyway. The hospice brothers warn you before departure. Do not expect kindness in every village. The words linger in your thoughts long after the mountains fade behind the caravan. Snow melts slowly at lower elevations now. The roads remain cold and muddy, but patches of dark earth appear beneath the trees again. Thin streams trickle beside the path, carrying broken ice downstream. For the first time in many days, you hear birds occasionally in the distance. It should feel comforting. Instead, the road feels tense in a different way. The coughing traveller remains behind at the hospice, too weak to continue. One servant with infected feet stays as well. The caravan leaves them under the brothers' care with promises to send word if possible. You suspect medieval people became skilled at uncertain farewells. Ahead, scattered villages dot the countryside beneath pale winter skies. Smoke rises from chimneys. Dogs bark as travellers approach. Children peer from doorways wrapped in wool blankets. Yet the atmosphere changes whenever outsiders arrive. People watch carefully. Doors close faster. Voices lower. Winter made many communities deeply suspicious of strangers. Food stores already ran low by late season. Illness spread easily. Travellers brought rumours of war, plague, theft, and unrest. A strange face walking into town during harsh weather could feel less like a guest and more like a potential disaster. One legal record from medieval England describes villages temporarily refusing entry to wandering groups during periods of sickness or famine. Local survival often mattered more than hospitality once winter pressures intensified. You understand that instinct more now after weeks on the road. Fear changes people quietly. The caravan reaches a small farming village near midday hoping to purchase oats and fresh water. At first, nobody approaches the travellers. Villagers simply stare from windows and fenced yards while snow drips steadily from roof edges into muddy lanes. The wagon driver finally speaks with an older farmer near the well. The conversation looks tense immediately. The farmer gestures toward the caravan, then toward the village, then shakes his head sharply. More villagers gather nearby, listening silently. You notice one woman pulling children farther back toward a cottage doorway. Another man carries an axe openly while pretending not to. The priest quietly explains the problem. A sickness passed through the region earlier that winter. Now every group of strangers brings fresh anxiety. You glance around the village more carefully then. Several cottages look abandoned. One barn roof partially collapsed beneath old snow. Thin faces watch from behind shutter cracks. The winter has not treated these people gently. A curious tradition from some rural communities involved hanging bundles of thorn branches near village entrances during outbreaks of illness or bad fortune. Travellers understood such signs as warnings to keep moving. Human beings have always invented creative ways to say, "Please leave immediately." Eventually the villagers agree to sell limited supplies, though nobody invites the caravan indoors. Payment exchanges hands quickly beside the muddy road while nervous silence hangs in the cold air. One merchant mutters angrily afterward about poor hospitality. The priest reminds him that hungry villages fear outsiders for practical reasons. Both men are probably correct. The caravan continues through open countryside beneath low grey clouds. Wind pushes damp cold through your cloak while wagon wheels sink heavily into muddy ruts. Meltwater drips constantly from bare branches overhead. The season feels caught between winter and spring now, which somehow makes travel worse. Frozen roads at least stay solid. Thawing roads become endless brown disasters swallowing boots and wagon wheels alike. You pass another village near evening. This one reacts even more coldly. The innkeeper refuses lodging immediately after hearing several travellers cough outside his doorway. A pair of armed locals stand near the stable watching the caravan carefully while muttering among themselves. No threats, just fear. Researchers examining medieval village life often point out how fragile winter survival could become for isolated communities. A few stolen food stores, a contagious illness, or too many hungry visitors might genuinely threaten everyone's chances of reaching spring safely. Understanding this does not improve your mood much while standing in cold rain mixed with snow. The caravan camps outside the village boundaries, beside a copse of leafless trees. Nobody likes the arrangement. The ground feels wet and miserable beneath your blankets. Smoke blows constantly into your eyes because damp wood burns poorly. Horses shift nervously nearby while distant village dogs bark through the darkness. And all the while, warm light glows faintly from cottages farther down the road where strangers are not welcome tonight. One merchant grows increasingly bitter beside the fire. He claims medieval hospitality is disappearing entirely. Another traveller replies that hospitality becomes difficult once granaries empty. The conversation dies after that, because everyone understands both sides too well. Later that night you wake suddenly to raised voices. Several villagers stand beyond the firelight carrying lanterns and farm tools. Their faces look nervous more than hostile. One older man steps forward demanding to know whether any travellers carry sickness from the mountains. The priest answers calmly. The villagers remain unconvinced. For several tense minutes, lantern light flickers across muddy cloaks and suspicious faces, while cold drizzle falls through bare branches overhead. Then one woman notices the pilgrims travelling quietly among the caravan. Her expression softens slightly. Religious travellers still carried certain protections in many places. Pilgrims, monks, and clergy often inspired more trust than merchants or wandering strangers, though certainly not everywhere. The villagers eventually leave after warning the caravan not to approach the wells or livestock during the night. Not exactly friendly, but not violent either. After they disappear into the darkness, the fire burns lower while travellers settle uneasily beneath damp blankets. A surviving travel account from Central Europe mentions merchants hanging small bells from wagons, partly so villagers could hear approaching caravans long before arrival. The sound apparently gave communities time to prepare or decide whether they even wanted visitors. Listening now to rain tapping softly against your cloak, you suspect many villages use that warning time to hide their best bread. Morning arrives cold and foggy. Mist curls across soaked fields while the caravan prepares silently for departure. Nobody waves toward the village as you leave, only a few distant figures watch from behind fences, while smoke rises from breakfast fires into the pale dawn sky. The road stretches onward through mud and lingering snow. And you realise another truth about medieval winter journeys. Not every danger came from wilderness. Sometimes fear waited inside warm villages too. Fear of strangers. Fear of sickness. Fear that one more hungry group arriving at the gates might push an already struggling community beyond what it could survive before spring finally returned. Rain replaces snow by the next evening. Cold rain. The worst kind. It falls steadily across the road while the caravan struggles through deep mud beneath a sky without colour. Water drips from wagon covers. Horses lower their heads miserably against the weather. Your cloak feels heavier with every mile until it clings damply against your shoulders like a soaked blanket. You miss proper snow now. At least snow pretended to be beautiful. Rain simply ruins everything. By sunset, the caravan fails to reach the next village marked on older maps. The road has become nearly impassable after days of thawing and sleet. Wagon wheels sink deep into brown sludge. One cart nearly tips sideways, crossing a flooded ditch. So the travellers stop beside a sparse grove of trees overlooking empty fields. No stable. No monastery walls glowing warmly through the dark. Only open land and worsening weather. You already know what comes next. Campfires. Weak little circles of survivors against the enormous winter night. The men gather damp branches and split wood beneath the rain, while others unload blankets and cooking pots from the wagons. Horses are tied close together for warmth. A crude shelter of canvas and rope goes up beside one cart, though the wind keeps threatening to tear it sideways. Lighting the fire becomes an entire emotional event. Smoke pours everywhere first. Wet wood hisses angrily. One servant crouches in the mud, blowing desperately against tiny flames while another shields the sparks with his body. Then finally fire catches. Small, fragile, beautiful. People crowd toward it immediately. Travel journals from the medieval period repeatedly describe fire as the centre of winter camps. Warmth mattered, obviously, but so did light. Beyond the glow of flames lay darkness filled with unseen roads, uncertain weather, wandering animals, and every anxious thought a tired traveller carried inside their mind. You sit close enough to the flames that your boots steam slightly. The heat reaches only one side of your body at a time. Your back remains cold while your face grows painfully hot. Smoke stings your eyes. Rain taps softly against wagon canvas nearby. And still the fire feels precious. One lesser-known detail from medieval camping practices involved travellers carrying embers inside covered containers during difficult journeys. Starting fires in wet conditions could become dangerously hard, so preserving coals from previous camps sometimes mattered enormously. Honestly, protecting fire probably felt more important than protecting certain relatives. Dinner tonight is miserable. Thin oat porridge with scraps of onion floating sadly in cloudy water. The merchants stare into their bowls with visible disappointment while rain drips steadily from tree branches overhead. Nobody lingers over the meal. People focus instead on drying gloves, rubbing aching feet, and adjusting blankets before full darkness settles across the fields. The wind strengthens after nightfall. You hear it moving through bare branches with long, hollow, sighing sounds. Firelight flickers constantly against the wagons, while shadows stretch and twist across the muddy camp. Then the flames begin shrinking. Wet wood again. The servant feeding branches into the fire curses softly as smoke thickens around the camp. Tiny sparks swirl upward into darkness before vanishing completely. Every traveller notices immediately. Conversation stop. People move closer. Because losing fire during a medieval winter camp could become genuinely terrifying. Without reliable warmth, soaked clothing stiffened with cold overnight. Sleep became difficult. Illness spread more easily. Morale collapsed astonishingly fast. And darkness itself felt heavier once the flames weakened. A manuscript from Northern Europe mentions travellers sleeping in shifts during severe weather, specifically to maintain fires through the night. Someone always needed to wake, feed the flames, check the horses, and watch for trouble beyond the camp. You draw the second watch alongside the priest and a bearded merchant who smells permanently of wet wool and garlic. Lucky you. Most of the caravan settles beneath blankets while rain continues falling steadily across the countryside. The horses stand close together near the wagons, occasionally stamping muddy hooves against the ground. You feed more wood into the fire carefully. The flames brighten briefly, then dim again. The priest mutters that damp weather kills fires faster than snow ever does. The merchant replies that rain was invented specifically to annoy travellers. Neither statement feels entirely impossible tonight. Far across the fields, a faint light appears briefly through the darkness. You notice it first, then it disappears. The merchant narrows his eyes suspiciously. Another camp, perhaps, or distant farm lanterns moving through the rain, hard to tell. Winter nights distorted distance strangely. Darkness swallowed familiar shapes while fog and weather transformed ordinary lights into unsettling little mysteries. Some communities believed wandering lanterns seen beside roads at night were spirits leading travellers astray into marshes or frozen ponds. Whether these tales came from superstition or simple exhaustion remains uncertain. Tired humans see peculiar things in darkness even now. The fire crackles weakly beside you. Rain hisses softly against the outer edges of the flames. Hours crawl past slowly. You begin understanding another hidden misery of medieval winter travel. Sleep itself becomes difficult. Either you wake freezing beneath damp blankets or you remain half-conscious, worrying the fire may die before morning. At some point during the night, one horse begins panicking suddenly. Chains rattle violently. Several travellers jerk awake in confusion while the animal snorts and kicks mud behind the wagons. The merchant grabs a lantern and rushes toward the noise. You follow immediately. Nothing waits beyond the camp except darkness and rain. Still the horses remain mischievous for several minutes afterward, and perhaps wolves again. Perhaps shifting shadows. Perhaps one exhausted animal simply frightened itself in the middle of the night like a medieval version of waking from a bad dream. Eventually calm returns. The merchant adds more wood to the fire with grim determination. Nobody sleeps deeply after that. Records from military campaigns and merchant caravans alike often describe the psychological strain of repeated cold camps during winter travel. Exhaustion accumulated gradually, tempers shortened, small problems felt enormous after enough sleepless nights beside failing fires. Toward dawn the rain finally slows. Mist drifts low across the muddy fields while pale grey light slowly spreads along the horizon. The camp looks terrible now. Blankets soaked, boots coated in mud, travellers pale and exhausted beside dying embers. The fire still burns though.
Barely.
Thin smoke curls upward into the cold morning air while tired hands stretch toward the remaining warmth. And in that moment you realise something medieval travellers understood perfectly well. A campfire was never just comfort, it was reassurance. Proof that human beings could still carve out one tiny island of warmth and light while endless winter darkness pressed against them from every side. Morning reveals what the rain has done to the road. Disaster. The fields around the caravan glisten beneath pale clouds while thick mud stretches in every direction like churned brown soup. Wagon ruts overflow with icy water. Boots sink immediately past the ankles. Horses pull reluctantly against harnesses already stiff with dried filth. You stare ahead at the road and feel genuine emotional fatigue. Winter travel has entered its mud season now. Some travellers feared this more than snowstorms. At least frozen roads remained solid beneath your feet. Thawing roads became endless traps swallowing wheels, animals, and patience together. Entire caravans slowed to crawling pace once late winter warmth softened the ground. You begin walking beside one wagon while cold mud sucks greedily at your boots with every step. Schlop, pull, schlop, pull. That sound follows the caravan for hours. The bearded trader mutters that spring roads are nature's revenge against optimism. Nobody disagrees. Several wagons already lean dangerously from yesterday's rain. One axle groans whenever the cart hits deeper ruts. Another merchant keeps checking ropes securing his cloth bundles as though anxiety alone might hold the cargo together. You pass a broken cart abandoned beside the road before noon. Its wheel lies half buried in mud nearby. Torn sacks spill rotten grain across the ditch while crows hop lazily around the wreckage. Whoever owned it clearly left in a hurry or lacked the strength to salvage much. Nobody pauses long to inspect it. The sight alone feels warning enough. In many parts of medieval Europe, late winter and early spring were infamous for turning roads nearly unusable. Some regions practically disappeared into mud for weeks at a time. Trade slowed dramatically, messengers arrived late, travellers became stranded between towns while waiting for roads to harden again. And unfortunately you are walking directly through this seasonal catastrophe. The caravan reaches a shallow incline during the afternoon. That is where everything falls apart. The lead wagon sinks first. One wheel drops deep into hidden mud with a wet cracking sound. The horses strain forward immediately, muscles trembling beneath damp hides, but the wagon refuses to move. Men shout. Mud splashes. The horses pull harder. Nothing. You push beside the others while freezing muck soaks through your boots. The wagon shifts slightly before sinking deeper. One servant nearly loses his footing completely and disappears knee-deep into the roadside sludge. The priest actually starts laughing. Not cheerful laughter either. The exhausted kind people produce when reality becomes too ridiculous to resist. Soon half the caravan stands in mud trying to free one stubborn wagon while cold drizzle begins falling from the grey sky again. A merchant from Bruges swears he once spent 4 days trapped on a road barely 20 miles from Paris because wagons kept sinking after winter thaw. Judging from the misery around you, his story suddenly sounds extremely believable. Eventually everyone unloads part of the cargo. Barrels, cloth bundles, grain sacks, crates of iron tools. The road becomes crowded with scattered goods while travellers strain against ropes tied around the wagon frame. Horses snort clouds into the damp air. Boots slide kuntos. Then finally the wagon lurches free with an enormous sucking noise from the mud below. Victory feels surprisingly emotional. Several people actually cheer. One exhausted servant kisses the wagon wheel sarcastically before immediately regretting the decision because it tastes like mud. The caravan continues slowly afterward. Very slowly, your legs ache from fighting the road itself. Every mile feels twice as long now. The horses look miserable. Travellers speak less with each passing hour. And still the mud keeps coming. One old account from a merchant family describes wheels becoming so clogged during spring thaw that the travellers carried wooden scrapers specifically to clear packed mud every few miles. Looking at the wagon wheels now, you understand perfectly why. The countryside grows flatter toward evening. Mist drifts low over waterlogged fields where bare trees reflect in flooded ditches. The road almost disappears beneath standing pools of brown water. Somewhere far away, church bells ring faintly through the damp air. The sound feels strangely distant and lonely. You notice more roadside crosses now too. Simple wooden markers leaning beside the road. Some decorated with faded cloth strips or tiny carved saints darkened by rain and age. Travellers pass them quietly. No one asks questions. Roads collected memories over centuries. Accidents, robberies, illness, lost travellers found too late after storms. Medieval people marked dangerous places carefully because roads held stories everyone understood. One merchant quietly touches 2 fingers against his chest while passing a crooked roadside shrine. Another spits into the mud for luck. Human beings become wonderfully superstitious once enough bad weather enters their lives. By dusk, the caravan reaches a low bridge crossing a swollen stream. The bridge looks terrible. Warped planks sag above fast-moving water thick with melting ice. Moss covers the rails, one support beam leans slightly sideways. Everyone automatically. You hear the water first. Rushing. Cold. Powerful. The wagon driver studies the bridge for a long, silent moment before deciding to cross one cart at a time. Nobody argues. The horses hesitate, stepping onto the slick wooden planks. The bridge creaks alarmingly beneath the first wagon while muddy water churns below in the fading light. Halfway across, one plank cracks sharply. Every person freezes. The wagon shifts. The horses panic briefly. But somehow the bridge holds. Barely. By the time the entire caravan reaches the opposite side, darkness has nearly settled completely across the countryside. No village. The moon appears. No inn lanterns glow ahead. Only wet fields and rising rock fog. So once again the travellers make camp beside the road. You almost resent the fire tonight while helping build it. Wet wood smokes terribly. Mud coats every blanket. Your boots squish unpleasantly whenever you moved. And yet when the flames finally rise against the darkness, everyone gathers close without hesitation. The priest dries soaked gloves beside the fire while one merchant carefully rubs ointment onto blistered feet. Nearby, the horses stand motionless beneath blankets, too exhausted even to complain anymore. Rain taps softly against the wagons. Mud cools slowly beneath the night air. And you sit beside the flames, understanding another quiet truth about medieval winter travel. The road itself could become your enemy. Not through violence, not through monsters, but through endless grinding exhaustion, mud pulling at every wheel, cold water soaking every step, tiny delays multiplying day after day until travellers lost strength, supplies and hope together beneath the endless grey sky. The fog arrives before dawn. Not ordinary morning mist drifting politely across the fields. This fog feels thick and heavy enough to touch. It rolls low over the road and wraps itself around the camp while the last embers of the fire glow faintly beneath wet ash. You wake shivering beneath damp blankets. Everything feels soaked. Your boots, your cloak, the wagon canvas overhead, even the air itself seems wet. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorts nervously while travellers rise slowly from miserable sleep. No one speaks loudly this morning. The fog changes moods. Shapes appear suddenly, then vanish again. Trees become towering shadows. Wagon lanterns float through the greyness like tiny stars trapped close to the ground. And beside medieval roads, Places like this encourage superstition beautifully. The caravan moves carefully after sunrise. Though sunrise barely exists inside the fog, pale light filters weakly through the mist while wheels creak through wet mud. You can hear travellers ahead and behind more easily than you can see them. A bell rings somewhere nearby. Soft, unseen. One pilgrim whispers a prayer instinctively. Roadside superstitions followed medieval travellers everywhere, especially during winter when exhaustion and darkness distorted ordinary landscapes into unsettling places. People carried charms, muttered blessings at crossroads, touched religious symbols while passing ruins, and avoided certain stretches of road entirely after nightfall. You are beginning to understand why. Ahead, the fog parts briefly around an ancient stone cross beside the road. Weather has worn its surface smooth over centuries. Moss grows thick around the base. Tiny scraps of cloth flutter from the arms of the cross tied there by passing travellers. The priest pauses long enough to touch the stone before continuing. Others do the same. One old merchant tosses a coin into the mud beside it without explanation. No one asks. In some regions, travellers believed roadside shrines protected against wandering spirits or bad luck during dangerous journeys. Other people simply appreciated any reminder that human beings had survived this road before them. Honestly, after enough cold nights and muddy roads, even a crooked old cross starts feeling emotionally supportive. The fog thickens again toward midday. You lose sight of the fields completely now. The world narrows into wet grey emptiness where only the next few yards remain visible. Water drips steadily from bare branches overhead. Horses move slowly with lowered heads while wagon wheels splash through hidden puddles. Then the caravan passes the ruins. At first you only notice broken walls emerging from the fog. A collapsed tower. Dark windows without glass. Stone foundations half swallowed by weeds and moss. An abandoned chapel, perhaps, or an old watch post. Hard to tell anymore. The younger servant immediately makes the sign of the cross. Another traveller refuses to look directly at the ruins while passing. Medieval roads gathered stories the way old coats gathered smoke. Once a building stood abandoned long enough, rumours attached themselves naturally. Travellers blamed lonely places for disappearances, strange lights, sudden storms, or unsettling sounds heard during night journeys. A collection of stories from Central Europe describes ruined roadside churches where travellers supposedly heard bells ringing despite empty towers. Modern explanations usually involve wind, distant villages, or exhausted imagination. Still, standing here in thick fog beside roofless stone walls, you would not volunteer to investigate after dark. The bearded trader quietly tells you one version connected to these ruins. Years earlier, according to local gossip, a priest froze nearby during a winter storm while trying to guide travellers towards shelter. Some claimed lantern lights still wandered around the road during heavy fog searching for lost people. The priest walking beside the caravan snorts dismissively at the tale. Then he starts walking slightly faster anyway. The road climbs through sparse woodland where damp branches arch overhead like black fingers through the mist. Water drips constantly onto your hood. Mud sucks greedily at wagon wheels again. You hear strange sounds more often now. Snapping twigs, distant crows. Something moving through brush beside the road. Probably harmless, probably. One medieval custom surviving in scattered records involved travellers speaking aloud while crossing lonely stretches of road because silence itself felt dangerous. Talking proved you were alive. Talking kept fear from growing too large inside your head. The caravan begins doing this naturally by afternoon. Stories spread between wagons. A merchant describes seeing glowing marsh lights near the coast years earlier. Another swears certain crossroads carried curses after executions or murders. One woman travelling with pilgrims insists she never sleeps beside standing stones because spirits dislike strangers. The fascinating thing is how calmly everyone discusses these fears. No dramatic terror. Just acceptance that winter roads contained mysteries people preferred respecting. Rain begins falling lightly again toward evening. Fog and drizzle together create a world entirely grey. Your cloak smells permanently of smoke and wet wool now. The horses look ghostly moving through the mist ahead. Then suddenly the lead wagon stops. You nearly walk into it before realising why. A crossroads. 2 roads vanish separately into fog, and the marker stone beside them has fallen broken into the mud. Wonderful. Several travellers gather around arguing immediately over directions. The wagon driver insists the eastern road leads toward the river settlements. Another merchant disagrees completely. No one can see far enough to confirm anything. Crossroads held enormous symbolic power in medieval imagination. Travellers paused there carefully. Some prayed. Others avoided them entirely after dark. Roads branching into uncertainty naturally invited stories about wandering spirits, thieves, demons, and terrible decisions. To be fair, modern highway exits can produce similar emotional experiences. The caravan debates for nearly half an hour while cold rain drips steadily from everyone's hoods. At last the priest notices faint carvings on the broken marker stone beneath layers of moss and mud. 1 arrow points southwest. The caravan follows that road cautiously. Darkness arrives quickly afterward. The fog glows faintly silver beneath the rising moon while lanterns swing beside the wagons. Every tree looks human-shaped at first glance. Every shadow seems to move twice. Then finally through the mist appears warm orange light. And in? Real. Solid. Beautiful. You nearly feel grateful enough to hug the building itself. Inside, heat rushes across your face while travellers crowd beside roaring fires. Someone cooks onions in butter near the hearth. Wet cloaks drip onto stone floors. Voices echo warmly through smoke-stained beams overhead. The innkeeper hangs bundles of dried herbs near the entrance for luck and good health. Rosemary, juniper, garlic. Perhaps the herbs truly help. Or perhaps after enough cold roads and haunted fog, people simply need comforting smells and familiar rituals to quiet their minds before sleep. You settle beside the fire, listening to rain tap softly against the shutters outside. And somewhere beyond the warm-in walls, hidden among crossroads and ruins and drifting fog, the old winter roads continue carrying their stories through the darkness. The inn feels unusually quiet the next morning. Not empty, just subdued. Rain taps softly against the shutters while travellers eat breakfast in tired silence beside the fire. Steam rises from bowls of oat porridge. Wet boots dry near glowing embers. Outside, pale fog still lingers over the road. Then you notice the young woman near the far wall. At first, she simply appears exhausted like everyone else. One hand rests against her lower back while her husband speaks anxiously with the innkeeper. Blankets and travel bundles surround them in a small untidy pile near the hearth. The priest beside you lowers his voice. She is expecting a child. You stare at him. Here, on the road. Apparently, yes. Families travel during winter more often than modern people imagine. Sometimes necessity overruled common sense completely. War displaced villages, trade demanded movement, relatives fell ill, land changed hands. Pilgrims continued their journeys regardless of weather, and occasionally pregnant women crossed frozen medieval roads because life gave them no safer alternative. The husband explains quietly that they hoped to reach relatives before the birth. The early snowstorm slowed them badly. Now the woman looks pale and deeply uncomfortable beneath layers of wool blankets. Everyone in the inn suddenly becomes interested without pretending to be. A widow travelling with pilgrims moves closer, offering herbs and advice immediately. Another woman rearranges blankets near the fire. Even the merchants stop arguing over road conditions for several minutes. Winter roads soften people sometimes, especially around children. Records from the period mention infants born inside inns, monasteries, wagons, roadside cottages, and temporary camps during long journeys. Travel rarely paused neatly around family emergencies. Medieval people simply adapted as best they could beneath whatever weather surrounded them. Outside, drizzle falls steadily from low grey skies. Inside, the woman grips the edge of the bench harder while breathing carefully through another wave of pain. The innkeeper suddenly looks extremely nervous. You cannot blame him honestly. One old traveller mutters that childbirth on winter roads carried terrible luck. Another insists children born during storms became unusually stubborn adults. Considering the circumstances, stubbornness seems reasonable. The caravan delays departure. Nobody openly complains about this, not even the merchants. You spend the morning near the stable helping scrape mud from wagon wheels while cold rain drips from the roof edges. Horses stamp impatiently in wet straw. Somewhere inside the inn, voices rise and fall softly around the labouring woman. The husband keeps pacing. He looks exhausted already. A travelling physician once wrote that pregnant women undertaking winter journeys should avoid rough wagons and frozen roads whenever possible, which sounds like excellent advice delivered to people who probably had no alternative routes, no spare money, and no control over the weather. By midday, the inn smells strongly of damp wood smoke, broth, and anxiety. Then finally a baby's cry cuts through the building. Everyone freezes. For one brief, strange moment, even the rain outside seems quieter. Then laughter spreads through the common room almost automatically. The innkeeper exhales loudly in relief. Someone near the fire actually applauds. The husband looks close to collapsing entirely. A girl, small, alive, wrapped quickly in wool blankets beside the hearth while snowmelt drips steadily from travellers' cloaks nearby. The sight changes the atmosphere inside the inn completely. People smile more now. Voices soften. One merchant donates dried fruit for the mother. Another traveller carves a tiny wooden cross from scrap kindling and leaves it near the family without explanation. Winter roads usually carried fear. Today they briefly carry something gentler. Still, practical concerns return quickly enough. The child cannot travel far immediately. The weather remains cold and wet. Supplies continue shrinking. The husband asks desperately whether any nearby village might shelter them until spring. The innkeeper hesitates. Not because he lacks sympathy, because feeding extra mouths through late winter frightened everyone. Eventually a local farming couple agrees to take the family temporarily, in exchange for coin and labour later during planting season. Relief spreads visibly across the young father's face. Medieval survival often depended on arrangements like this. Temporary kindness, shared burdens, informal promises made beside winter fires. Not every story on the road ended in disaster. The caravan finally departs during the afternoon. Fog drifts across muddy fields while crows circle overhead through pale skies. You glance back once toward the inn. The young mother sits near the window holding the infant beside the firelight. Tiny life beginning in the middle of mud and cold and uncertainty. Strangely hopeful. The road continues through rolling farmland where patches of snow still linger beneath hedges and trees. Water runs beside the road in swollen ditches reflecting the grey sky above. The priest walks quietly beside you for a while. Then he says something interesting. Winter journeys make people remember they belong to one another. You think about that while watching the caravan ahead. The limping horses, the soaked cloaks, the exhausted travellers still moving forward together despite everything. One lesser-known custom in some regions involved mothers placing small religious tokens inside infants' blankets during difficult journeys. Tiny saints carved from wood, cloth scraps touched to shrines, bits of prayer written on parchment. Protection mattered deeply when survival felt uncertain. By evening the rain finally stops. Cold air settles across the countryside while streaks of fading gold appear briefly beneath the clouds. Travellers move more slowly now from exhaustion than weather. Then somewhere ahead you hear singing, children's voices. The caravan rounds a bend in the road and finds a small village preparing for a local feast day despite the lingering winter conditions. Lanterns hang beside doorways, smoke rises warmly into the darkening sky, villagers gather near a chapel carrying baskets and candles. The atmosphere feels startlingly alive after so many bleak roads. One elderly woman hands pieces of warm bread to passing travellers without charge. Another insists the pilgrims join evening prayers indoors. Warmth, light, human noise. The village feels almost unreal. You sit beside a fire later that night listening to distant singing outside while villagers celebrate quietly against the long winter season. and somewhere in a small roadside inn behind you, a newborn child sleeps beside the hearth, while medieval roads continue stretching endlessly through mud and cold and darkness beyond the firelight. You leave the singing village beneath a hard silver dawn. The rain has frozen overnight. Every puddle along the road wears a thin crust of ice that cracks sharply beneath boots and wagon wheels. Frost glitters across fences and bare branches while pale smoke rises from cottages into the still morning air. The world feels colder again, sharper, and ahead waits another river crossing. Nobody says this enthusiastically. The caravan descends through low woodland where frozen leaves crunch beneath the horses' hooves. Thin streams run black beneath ice along the roadside ditches. You pull your cloak tighter while breath curls white through the air once more. Winter never fully releases its grip. Not yet. The wagon driver explains that the nearest bridge belongs to a local lord who charges tolls for crossing. Everyone groans softly at this news. Medieval roads often depended on bridges, ferries, and mountain passes controlled by whoever possessed enough armed men to claim them. And naturally, those people enjoyed collecting money from exhausted travellers. A narrow stone tower finally appears near midday beside the riverbank. Below it stretches the bridge. Long. Old. Solid enough. Probably dark water rushes beneath the arches carrying broken chunks of ice downstream. The river looks swollen from recent thaw and rain. Mist hangs above the surface, drifting slowly through the cold air. 2 armed guards wait beside the entrance wrapped in heavy cloaks. One carries a spear. Spear. The other carries the expression of a man deeply committed to making your day worse. The caravan halts. The toll keeper emerges from the tower shortly afterward carrying a wax tablet and looking entirely too pleased with himself. He examines the wagons carefully while naming crossing fees high enough to make several merchants visibly pale. Arguments begin immediately. Of course they do. Trade caravans and toll collectors spent centuries performing this exact unpleasant dance across Europe. Travellers accused bridgekeepers of greed. Local lords insisted roads and crossings required maintenance. Everyone probably exaggerated dramatically. You stand beside the horses while cold wind sweeps off the river carrying the smell of wet stone and icy water. Nearby, one pilgrim quietly counts coins with increasing despair. The tollkeeper notices. He shrugs. Winter roads did not reward sympathy consistently. One old merchant beside you mutters that certain bridge guards charged extra during storms because travellers had fewer alternatives. Judging from the expressions around you, nobody finds this surprising. Eventually payment changes hands. Not happily. Happily. The first wagons begin crossing the bridge while iron-shod wheels clatter loudly against frozen stone. The sound echoes across the river valley. Horses snort clouds into the cold air while guards watch carefully from beside the tower. Halfway across, you glance over the side. Immediately regrettable. Dark water churns far below between jagged ice and broken branches swept downstream. The current looks powerful enough to swallow wagons whole. Travellers in the Middle Ages feared bridges almost as much as rivers themselves because collapse, ice damage, flooding, or poor maintenance could turn crossings deadly without warning. Some bridges remained little more than wooden structures, patched repeatedly over generations. This stone bridge feels sturdier than most. Still terrifying, though. Near the centre stands a tiny chapel built directly onto the bridge itself. Candles flicker faintly behind narrow windows. Travellers pause briefly there while crossing. Some whisper prayers. Others touch the doorway as they pass. One merchant kisses 2 fingers and presses them against the chapel wall before hurrying onward. You suspect people became deeply spiritual whenever standing above freezing rivers. On the far side of the bridge, the road narrows again between steep wooded banks. Ice clings to rocks beside the path while sunlight glimmers weakly through bare branches overhead. The caravan moves more carefully now. Everyone seems tired after weeks on the road. Shoulders slump lower, conversations grow shorter. Even the horses plod forward with weary resignation. Then shouting erupts behind you. One wagon has stopped near the bridge entrance. The rear axle cracked. perfect timing, the damaged cart leans dangerously sideways while guards and merchants argue immediately over where repairs may happen. The tollkeeper refuses to let the wagon block the bridge road. The merchants refuse to abandon expensive cargo beside the river. Voices rise sharply through the cold air. You notice something interesting then. Winter travel constantly balanced cooperation and selfishness together. People helped one another survive storms and sickness. Yet supplies, money, shelter, and time remained painfully limited. Tension always waited beneath the surface. The bridge guards finally drag the damaged wagon aside near the tower while carpenters inspect the axle. Hours pass slowly afterward. Cold settles deeper into your boots while travellers linger beside the riverbank waiting for repairs. Some huddle near tiny fires built against the stone walls. Others trade bits of food or gossip to pass the time. A wandering musician appears somehow from the opposite road carrying a battered lute beneath his cloak. No one understands where he came from exactly. Medieval roads simply produce strange people occasionally. He plays soft music beside the bridge tower, while snowflakes drift lightly through the afternoon air. The melody echoes strangely across the water. Even the guards seem calmer afterward. One tale circulating among travellers claims certain bridges collected ghosts because so many accidents happened there over centuries. Drowned merchants, washed away pilgrims, wagon drivers crushed during floods. Looking down at the roaring river below, you understand how such stories survived. By late afternoon, the repairs finish. The caravan finally moves onward once more beneath darkening skies. Thin snow begins falling again while the river fades behind the trees. You walk beside the priest in tired silence for a while. Then he gestures back toward the bridge barely visible through the woods. Funny thing about roads, he says quietly. They make strangers depend on people they would never trust at home. The thought stays with you. Bridge guards, innkeepers, ferrymen, monks, villagers. Every winter traveller relied constantly on unfamiliar hands while moving through dangerous landscapes, and every crossing became a small bargain with uncertainty. That night the caravan reaches another roadside inn tucked beside a frozen stream. Firelight glows warmly through crooked windows while snow gathers softly along the roof. Inside, travellers crowd around the hearth trading stories about roads washed out by floods, bridges collapsing beneath overloaded carts, and ferrymen charging outrageous prices during storms. You sit listening beside the flames, while outside the winter river continues rushing unseen through darkness. Cold, restless, always moving beneath the night. The monastery bells begin before sunrise. Deep, slow sounds drifting through the frozen air while darkness still clings to the hills. You wake beneath rough wool blankets inside the roadside inn, listening to the bells echo faintly across the countryside beyond the shutters. Someone nearby groans and rolls over. Someone else is already coughing again. Winter roads never truly allow proper rest. Outside, frost silvers the world once more. Thin ice rims the stream beside the inn, while smoke rises straight upward from chimneys into the pale morning sky. The caravan prepares quietly beneath the cold air, tightening straps and checking wheels before another day of travel. The priest informs everyone that a monastery lies only a few miles ahead. You have never heard better news. The road climbs gradually through wooded hills where pine needles crunch beneath the horses' hooves. Sunlight filters weakly through branches dusted with old snow. Here and there, frozen puddles gleam beside the path like cracked glass. The bells continue faintly in the distance, steady, comforting somehow. Medieval monasteries often functioned like lifelines for winter travellers. Some stood beside major trade routes. Others occupied remote valleys or mountain roads where storms trapped pilgrims and merchants regularly. Many offered food, shelter, medical care, and safe walls during dangerous seasons. Not entirely from kindness alone. Hospitality formed all. Part of religion's duty. Still, when you have spent enough nights soaked beside muddy roads, duty and kindness start feeling wonderfully similar. The monastery appears around midday beyond a line of bare trees. Stone walls, a squat bell tower, smoke drifting from several chimneys, gardens sleeping beneath frost. You notice travellers visibly relax upon seeing it. Shoulders lower, voices soften, even the horses seem calmer approaching the gates. A brother in dark robes greets the caravan without surprise. Clearly winter travellers arrive often here. Inside the walls, the atmosphere changes immediately. Wind fades. The courtyard smells faintly of bread and wood smoke. Chickens wander between stone buildings while novices carry buckets of water across frozen ground. Order. Warmth. Routine. After weeks on uncertain roads, the monastery feels almost unreal. The brothers lead travellers toward a long hall lined with benches and fireplaces. Wet cloaks steam gently near the heat. Pots of soup simmer over the flames, releasing smells so comforting you briefly consider joining a monastic life entirely. Then you remember monks wake before dawn forever. Perhaps not. One young brother moves quietly through the hall, distributing cups of warm cider mixed with herbs. Another checks swollen feet and blistered hands beside the fire. A merchant near you nearly falls asleep while eating. The exhaustion in the room feels enormous. You notice how differently people behave here compared with crowded inns. Voices stay lower. Arguments fade quickly. Even the children travelling with pilgrims seem calmer, beneath the stone ceilings and candlelight. The monastery creates temporary peace around weary people. One elderly monk notices your interest in the walls lined with painted saints and faded maps. He explains that travellers sometimes leave written notes behind describing road conditions ahead. Flooded crossings, collapsed bridges, bandits spotted near forests, storms approaching mountain routes. Information mattered desperately on medieval roads. News moved slowly, and winter could transform safe paths into death traps within days. The monk points toward one note warning travellers about wolves near a northern valley. You try not to think about that section of the journey again. In the infirmary beside the chapel, several sick travellers already rest beneath blankets. One man with frostbitten fingers sleeps near the fire, while a brother changes cloth bandages carefully. Nearby, an old woman murmurs prayers beside her injured son. The monastery smells of herbs, smoke, beeswax, and damp wool. Oddly comforting mouth now. A handwritten account preserved in one religious house described monks warming wine with honey and spices for half-frozen travellers arriving during snowstorms. Looking around this hall, you can imagine similar scenes repeating winter after winter for centuries. Outside, the weather begins changing again. Snowflakes drift lazily across the courtyard by late afternoon, while bells ring softly overhead. Travellers gather near the fires telling quieter stories than usual. A few pilgrims kneel inside the chapel whispering prayers beside candlelight. You wander briefly along the cloister walkway where snow settles against old stone arches. The silence feels peaceful here rather than threatening. Somewhere deeper within the monastery, monks sing evening prayers in low-echoing voices. The sound carries through the cold air beautifully. One brother explains that winter frightened travellers not only because of physical danger, but because roads separated people from familiar rhythms. Home fires, church bells, family meals, predictable sleep. Monasteries restored a little of that order temporarily. You understand exactly what he means. After enough nights spent listening for wolves or storms or cracking ice, hearing ordinary bells and quiet singing feels strangely emotional. A small detail catches your attention near the entrance hall later that evening. Travellers have carved names into the wooden beams over many years. Dates, symbols, tiny prayers, simple messages like safe crossing or arrived before snow. Human beings always want proof that others survived difficult roads before them. The meal that night feels almost luxurious by winter standards. Thick vegetable soup, fresh bread still warm from ovens, soft cheese, weak ale. Nobody speaks much while eating because exhaustion and gratitude have finally defeated conversation. The bearded merchant beside you eventually mutters that monasteries feed people better than some noble courts. A monk overhears and smiles very slightly without denying it. Snow falls steadily outside now. You watch flakes gather along the window ledges, while firelight flickers across the hall. Nearby travellers mend gloves, dry socks, sharpen knives, or simply stare into the flames with hollow, tired eyes. One young novice quietly places heated stones beneath several blankets for elderly pilgrims sleeping near the wall. No grand gesture, just practiced kindness. As night deepens, the monastery settles into silence broken only by distant bells and crackling fires. Beyond the walls, winter roads continue winding through forests, rivers, bridges, and frozen fields. But here, for one rare evening, the dangers feel far away. You sleep beneath heavy blankets while snow drifts softly across the courtyard outside. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the monastery gates, other travellers still wander the cold roads, searching desperately for the same warm light now glowing safely around you. By morning, the world has vanished. You step outside the monastery gates, expecting snowy roads and distant hills. Instead, you find white emptiness stretching in every direction. Snow fell all night. Wind followed afterward. The road disappeared completely. Even the wagon tracks from yesterday have vanished beneath smooth drifting layers. Trees emerge faintly through the blowing snow like dark smudges against the pale sky. The air itself seems colourless. Several travellers stop walking immediately after seeing it. The mountain guide from earlier in the journey would have hated this weather. One monk helping near the gates shakes his head quietly and warns everyone to stay close together once they leave the monastery road markers behind. Because getting lost in winter did not always happen dramatically. Sometimes the world simply erased itself around you. The caravan delays departure briefly while travellers wrap scarves tighter and secure ropes between several wagons. Bells are tied to the lead horses so the others can hear movement through the blowing snow. You remember those pilgrims from earlier carrying bells through the fog. Now the sound feels less charming, more necessary. The snowfall thickens as the caravan moves onward across open farmland. Wind pushes constantly at your cloak while icy flakes sting your face. You can barely see beyond the nearest wagon. The road exists somewhere beneath the snow. Probably a squirrel. One servant accidentally steps into a buried ditch almost immediately and disappears waist-deep with a startled shout. Several travellers drag him free while the snow whirls around them in blinding waves. Nobody laughs. The weather feels too dangerous for humour now. Winter travellers feared losing roads almost more than storms themselves. Once familiar paths vanished. Every field looked identical. Villages disappeared behind curtains of snow. Rivers, marshes, and frozen ponds blended invisibly into the landscape. People wandered in circles without realizing it. You begin understanding how terrifyingly easy that would be. The bells tied to the horses ring softly through the storm. Clink, clink, clink. That sound becomes your anchor. The caravan moves slowly across the white landscape while travellers hunch against the wind. Snow gathers thickly on cloaks and wagon covers. Fingers ache despite gloves. Your eyelashes collect tiny crystals of ice whenever you blink. At midday, the caravan stops near what might be a road marker. Or a dead tree. Hard to tell anymore. The wagon driver and priest argue quietly over direction, while snow blows around them in endless shifting curtains. One merchant insists the road should curve west toward a village. Another claims they already passed the turn earlier. The frightening part is that everyone sounds uncertain. A medieval traveller once described heavy snowfall as a second night falling over the earth. Standing here now, you understand perfectly. Distance disappears, shapes lose meaning. The world narrows into cold wind and instinct. The caravan continues anyway. What else can it do? You begin noticing how distance changes during storms. Wind never fully stops, yet everything else fades beneath it. No birds, no running water, no distant farm sounds. Only boots crunching through snow, only wagon wheels grinding softly beneath hidden drifts. Then suddenly the lead horse stops moving. The entire caravan nearly collides together behind it. Ahead lies a frozen pond hidden completely beneath fresh snow. The surface looks exactly like solid ground. One more step and the wagon might have crossed directly onto thin ice. The priest closes his eyes briefly in relief. Several travellers whisper prayers. Someone ties a strip of cloth to a nearby branch afterward. A quiet little thank you to the world for not killing them today. The storm worsens by afternoon. Wind roars now across the open land, hard enough to stagger people sideways. Snow swirls so thickly that the nearest wagon fades in and out like a ghost. You lose sight of the rear travellers completely for several terrifying moments. Shouts echo through the white haze, then bells answer somewhere nearby. The caravan regroups slowly. A small collection of instructions written for medieval messengers advise travellers caught in blizzards to avoid wandering alone even for short distances. Visibility vanished too quickly. People became disoriented almost immediately once separated from companions. You understand that fear deeply now. Even turning your head too long toward the storm feels dangerous. Then the worst moment comes. The road splits somewhere beneath the snow. No one notices. The lead wagon drifts gradually left while several others follow. A smaller group behind continues straight ahead unknowingly through the blowing snow. The separation happens quietly, almost invisibly. It takes several minutes before someone realizes half the bells sound farther away than before. Panic erupts instantly. Travellers shout names into the storm while wind tears the words apart. The wagon driver orders lanterns raised despite daylight because visibility has collapsed completely. You spin toward the white emptiness, searching desperately for movement. Nothing. Only snow. Only wind. Then faintly through the storm comes answering bells somewhere to the right. Relief crashes through the caravan so suddenly your knees feel weak. The separated travellers emerge slowly from the snowfall several minutes later, coated in white frost and looking genuinely shaken. One young pilgrim has tears frozen along her cheeks. Nobody scolds anyone afterward. Fear has already done that. Stories circulated for centuries about travellers vanishing during winter storms only a few miles from shelter. Some wandered into forests, others froze beside roads invisible beneath drifting snow. Occasionally entire groups disappeared until spring thaw revealed what happened. And perhaps most frightening of all, many of them probably never realised how close safety actually was. By late afternoon, the caravan spots dark shapes ahead through the storm. Building. At first, you distrust them completely. The fog and snow have already transformed too many trees and shadows today. But this time the shapes remain solid. A village. Tiny. Real. Smoke rises faintly into the stormy sky while dim lanterns glow behind shuttered windows. The travellers nearly stumble toward it from exhaustion. Villagers hurry outside, helping guide wagons through deep drifts into shelter between cottages. Doors open, fires glow, voices call through the storm. Warmth, human sound. You enter a crowded cottage smelling of cabbage soup, wet wool and burning peat. Snow melts instantly from your cloak onto the floorboards while exhausted travellers huddle near the fire. No one speaks much at first. People simply stare into the flames quietly while feeling returns painfully to the frozen hands. Outside, the storm continues swallowing the roads completely. But tonight you reach shelter before the world erased you from it. And medieval travellers knew there were many who had not been so fortunate. The storm finally breaks 2 days later. You leave the tiny village beneath clear skies for the first time in what feels like half your life. Sunlight glitters across deep snowdrifts. Smoke rises peacefully from cottage chimneys. Somewhere nearby a dog barks with surprising enthusiasm for such cold weather. The world looks cleaner after the storm. Sharper. Almost new. And yet the travellers themselves look older now. Faces appear thinner. Cloaks hang heavier across tired shoulders. Boots show cracks from constant wet and cold. Even laughter sounds quieter than it did to Leah in the journey. Winter roads leave marks on people, not always visible ones. The caravan has grown smaller too. Some pilgrims stayed behind in villages or monasteries waiting for safer weather. A merchant turned south toward larger trade roads. The feverish travellers remained somewhere beyond the mountains, recovering beneath monastery blankets if fortune treated them kindly. Roads scattered people as often as they gathered them. You continue eastwards beneath pale sunlight, while snow crunches firmly beneath the wagons once more. Frozen roads have returned after the storm, making travel easier for now. Horses move with steadier confidence, wheels no longer sink endlessly into mud. The relief almost feels suspicious. You walk beside the priest through open countryside where ravens wheel slowly overhead. Here and there, frozen rivers glitter between bare trees. The air smells clean enough to hurt your lungs slightly. The priest notices you staring toward the horizon. You are thinking about home, he says. Perhaps you are. Long journeys changed medieval travellers in strange ways. People left villages expecting roads to feel temporary. Then weeks or months passed among storms, strangers, illness and uncertainty until ordinary life began feeling distant and unreal. The road itself became a kind of world. World vid das clear. You stop near a roadside market town around midday where traders crowd the square beneath colourful wool awnings. The noise feels overwhelming after so many isolated roads. Voices echo everywhere. Chickens flap between muddy boots. Blacksmith hammers ring sharply through the cold air. Warm bread smells drift from nearby ovens. You nearly follow the scent instinctively like a starving wolf. The caravan rests here while merchants trade cloth and salted fish for fresh supplies. Travellers gather around fires in the market square exchanging stories about road conditions farther north. One old man describes snowdrifts taller than wagons blocking an entire valley route. Another swears bandits disguised themselves as frozen pilgrims near a forest crossing earlier in that winter. Whether every tale proves true hardly matters. Road stories grow larger while travelling. That feels inevitable somehow. You notice small habits among the caravan now that did not exist earlier in the journey. Travellers check one another's boots automatically before departure. People share firewood more quickly. Someone always keeps hot broth ready for the older pilgrims. The road has trained everyone quietly. Even fear changes shape over time. At the beginning of winter travel, dangers seem dramatic and distant. Wolves, avalanches, bandits hiding beside frozen forests. Now the fears feel smaller and more personal. A broken bootlace. A sick horse. Wet blankets before nightfall. Missing the last inn before darkness. Those little things mattered because winter punished mistakes relentlessly. Near sunset, the caravan reaches familiar territory for several merchants travelling beside you. You can tell immediately from the change in their voices. They point toward distant church towers and frozen fields while remembering roads travelled years earlier. One merchant even smiles for the first time in days. The sight feels almost shocking. You continue through villages preparing quietly for evening meals. Lanterns glow behind shutters. Children carry bundles of firewood across snowy yards. The smell of roasting onions and smoke drifts through the cold twilight air. Home exists for these people. Warm, predictable room. Known faces. Regular sleep. The longer you travel, the more miraculous ordinary life begins to seem. One weary pilgrim removes a tiny shell badge from his cloak while resting beside the road. He rubs dirt from its surface carefully before tying it back again. Proof. That is what travellers carried home besides goods or stories. Proof they endured the road. A chronicler once described returning merchants as men who looked weathered by many skies. Watching the caravan now beneath the fading winter light, you understand exactly what he meant. The road settles into your body. You feel it in stiff knees while climbing wagons. In the way travellers scan clouds automatically now. In how everyone notices smoke on the horizon before anything else. Darkness approaches slowly beneath clear skies. The caravan reaches one final roadside inn before the larger towns beyond tomorrow's route. Compared with earlier shelters, this place feels almost luxurious. Thick walls block the wind, Fresh straw covers the floors. Someone even hangs dried lavender beside the sleeping rooms. An astonishing level of optimism, honestly. You sit beside the hearth while snow falls softly beyond the windows again. Not storm snow this time. Gentle snow. Quiet snow. Travellers speak more easily tonight. Stories drift across the room between mugs of ale and bowls of stew. One man remembers falling through river ice years earlier and losing a boot downstream. Another claims his cousin once got lost so badly during a blizzard, he accidentally joined the wrong pilgrimage for 3 weeks. The room fills with tired laughter, and beneath it all sits another feeling. Relief, because the journey is nearly over. Not completely. Winter roads never relax enough for certainties. But close. Very close now. You step briefly outside before sleep. Snowflakes drift lazily through the dark air, while the inn glows warmly behind you. Far beyond the fields, distant lanterns flicker along another road where unseen travellers continue moving through the cold night. More wagons. More pilgrims. More exhausted strangers searching for shelter before dawn. The winter roads never truly empty. They simply carry different people through the same darkness year after year, while storms rise, fires burn low, and tired travellers dream quietly of reaching home alive before the season finally ends. The final morning arrives quietly. No storm, no shouting merchants, no cracking river ice or distant wolf howls drifting through frozen forests. Only soft snowfall descending through pale dawn light while the caravan prepares for the last stretch of road ahead. You step outside the inn and breathe deeply. The air smells of smoke, snow, and cold stone. Somewhere nearby a rooster complains half-heartedly about the morning. Wagon wheels creak softly while horses stamp frost from their hooves. Everything feels calmer now. Not safer exactly. Just quieter. The road ahead curves gently across low hills where snow rests in smooth silver layers beneath the waking sky. Far in the distance you can already see faint smoke rising from larger settlements beyond the valley. Civilization. Warm rooms. Real beds. People who have not spent weeks smelling permanently of wet wool and horse leather. The caravan moves slowly this morning, almost reluctantly. Travellers who once hurried desperately towards shelter now linger beside the wagon, speaking softly together. Strange how suffering creates attachment. Even the bearded merchant looks thoughtful instead of irritated for once. The winter road has worn everyone down into honesty. You walk beside the priest while snowflakes drift lazily across the fields. Tiny sounds carry clearly in the still air. Harness chains jingling, boots crunching through fresh powder, ravens calling from bare trees along the roadside. No one talks much about fear anymore. There is no need. The road already taught its lessons. You pass familiar things now. Farmhouses standing close together instead of isolated cabins. Road markers cleared regularly of snow. Stone bridges repaired recently enough to trust. Children waving openly from village fences instead of hiding behind shuttered windows. The closer travellers moved toward larger towns, the more the world seemed connected again. Safer roads changed human behaviour completely. A young pilgrim walking beside the caravan removes her bell from the walking staff at midday. She laughs softly while tucking it into her satchel. "No more storm," she says. You hope she is right. The caravan stops briefly beside a roadside shrine overlooking the valley. Candles burn inside, protected from the wind behind coloured glass. Melted wax drips thickly down the stones. Several travellers pause there quietly. Not dramatic prayers, just small moments. Hands against cold stone, eyes closed briefly. Thankfulness, perhaps, or relief, or simple exhaustion. After enough winter roads, surviving begins to feel sacred in its own way. You continue downhill while sunlight slowly brightens behind thinning clouds. Snow melts from branches overhead in tiny glittering drops. The horses move easier now on firmer roads. One merchant even begins humming softly beside the wagons. A terrible humming voice, honestly, but hopeful. You realise the road itself looks different too. less threatening. Not because winter changed, because you did. At the beginning of the journey, every dark forest hid wolves. Every stranger seemed suspicious. Every snowfall carried danger. Now you notice smaller things instead. The smell of bread from distant villages, the warmth rising from horse flanks and cold air, the comfort of shared firelight after sunset, the way travellers automatically reach for one another during storms. Winter roads frightened medieval travellers because survival depended on so many fragile pieces holding together at once. Weather, animals, shelter, health, strangers, luck, and still people kept travelling. That may be the most remarkable part. Trade continued. Pilgrim walked onward. Messengers carried letters through soapstorms. Families crossed frozen landscapes searching for safer futures. Human beings kept moving through winter because life gave them little choice. The valley town appears fully by late afternoon. Stone walls, church towers, smoke rising thickly into the cold sky. The sound of distant bells drifting across the snowy fields. Travellers begin separating naturally now as familiar roads branch outward. Merchants turn toward the market streets. Pilgrims head toward churches and hostels. Wagon drivers shout final farewells while adjusting reins. The caravan dissolves the same way storms dissolve eventually. Quietly, you watch the bearded trader disappear into crowded streets carrying his worn satchel beneath one arm. The priest pauses beside a chapel doorway before turning toward evening prayers. Several pilgrims continue onward together beneath falling snow, bells tied once more to their staffs for whatever roads still wait ahead. And suddenly the journey feels very long. Not in miles, in memory. You remember wolves moving through dark forests beside the road, the crack of river ice beneath frightened horses, fog swallowing crossroads and ruined chapels, fires struggling against rain-soaked nights, monastery bells echoing through snow, a newborn child crying beside an inn hearth while winter storms rattled the shutters outside. All those little moments stitched together by cold roads stretching endlessly beneath grey skies. Dusk settles gently across the town now. Lanterns glow behind windows. Snow drifts softly across rooftops and narrow streets. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs inside a warm tavern, while musicians play faintly in the distance. Ordinary life continues. The road releases you back into it slowly, and as the final light fades beyond the snowy hills, you understand what medieval travellers feared most during winter journeys. Not simply death, not simply storms. It was the terrible uncertainty of being small and vulnerable inside a vast cold world where shelter might disappear, roads might vanish, and darkness could arrive long before safety ever did. Yet somehow, year after year, people still walked those roads, still lit their fires, still followed distant bells through snow and fog toward whatever warmth waited ahead. The snowfall grows softer now, quieter. The town settles gently into evening while the last travellers disappear through lantern-lit streets one by one. And far beyond the walls, beyond the frozen fields and dark forests, the winter roads continue winding silently through the night beneath the endless medieval sky. The fire burns low now. The road is finally behind you. You can let it drift away little by little. Like snow settling softly across old wagon tracks no one needs to follow tonight. Imagine the sounds fading first. The creak of wheels, the bells tied to horses in the storm, the distant barking dogs from frozen villages. Even the wind moving through dark forests begins to soften now, becoming gentler, quieter, farther away. The travellers are resting. The merchants sleep beside warm hearths with muddy boots drying near the fire. Pilgrims curl beneath wool blankets inside monasteries where candlelight flickers softly along stone walls. Horses rest in warm stables, breathing slow clouds into clean straw. And somewhere on a quiet roadside, snow falls silently across the empty tracks of an old winter road. No fear now, no storms, no rushing towards shelter before darkness. Only stillness, the kind of stillness that comes after a long journey finally ends. You stand for one last moment beneath the cold medieval sky and watch soft lantern light glowing through distant windows, safe places, warm places, human places. Then even those lights begin fading gently into the snowfall. The roads grow quiet, the forests sleep, the rivers continue flowing unseen beneath their thin silver ice, and slowly, peacefully, the whole winter world settles into silence. Sweet dreams.